We're here this morning in the investigation into the implementation of a rule regarding sound from wind generation facilities pursuant to Section 12A of Act 174. This is by the way, this is the Public Service Board. My name is Jim Boltz. I'm the chair. With me is Sarah Hoffman, a board member, and Margaret Cheney, the other board member. This is a workshop, and so it's a somewhat informal proceeding. It's not a technical hearing. We sent out a procedural order regarding this workshop on November 23rd that laid out primarily how we were going to proceed with this, and I'll just remind everybody about it today. We are going to hear from the Vermont Department of Public Service, the Town of Windham, Vermont Public Interest Research Group, Vermonters for a Clean Environment, Renewable Energy Vermont, Paul Bruja, Green Mountain Power Corporation, Sally and Bruce Colopy, Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, and Resource Systems Group, Inc. We're going to hear from folks in that order. That was how we laid it out, as I understood it. Each person or organization listed that I just mentioned have approximately 10 minutes to present their rule proposal, followed by approximately 20 minutes for question and discussion with the board and other workshop participants. I would urge everyone to, we have a court reporter here, this is going to be transcribed, and so I'd urge everyone when you speak to speak loudly enough for us to hear us up here or to come up to the podium, and also to state your name so for the court reporter at the outset of each time you begin speaking. Presenters are encouraged to focus their presentations on areas where their rule proposal differs from the other proposals that have been filed, so that the content of each of the individual presentations is not duly repetitious. So I think we're ready to go unless either of my board members want to say something.
Our understanding is some people are going to cede time to others. So if your name is called, please indicate if you're ceding your time or if you're taking someone else's time upon agreement.
And then if you are, please state whose time you're borrowing and how much of it you're borrowing. Thanks. So we'll start, I guess, by hearing from the Vermont Department of Public Service.
Thank you. Members of the board, really quickly. Earlier this week, the department reached out to the other individuals and groups as part of this workshop to try to determine who was and was not going to present at the workshop today. There was some feedback, but we still are a little unclear about who is and is not. This is the department's understanding that at least 3 individuals or groups, Agency of Natural Resources, RSG, and GMP will not be presenting. The department hasn't received explicitly been ceded time from any of those groups. However, we think that given that there's an hour and a half roughly between those 3 groups that will not present, the department would like to request that we have a half hour to present. We have 2 experts here plus the Commissioner Recchia of the department. We think given the size and scope of the department's filing, we think a half-hour presentation would be beneficial to the board and to those in attendance.
Is anyone from GMP here?
Yes.
Is what what the department is saying, is that accurate?
Absolutely.
Okay. And who are the other 2 parties that you mentioned?
The Agency of Natural Resources and RSG.
Okay. Is anyone from the Agency for Natural Resources here? All right. Since they're not here, I'm assuming they've ceded their time. And then RSG.
Yeah, Eddie Duncan with RSG. We ceded our time. Prior to this, we had sent a correspondence to the board ceding our time to the department and to be heard, but I'm happy for the department to make that determination how they want to use that time.
Okay, thank you. So why don't you go ahead, then?
Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, board. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Is this on? Working? No? Doesn't sound like it is. Thank you. All right. How's that? Everybody here? Okay. Thank you very much for holding this proceeding, this workshop. My name is Chris Recchia. I'm Commissioner of the Public Service Department. I'm only going to speak for a couple of minutes, and then we will have 2 experts that we've been working with for several years now, Payam Astiani and Dr. Chris Olson. And they will do the major part of the presentations. Afterwards, we will all be available for questions if you wish. what we have proposed to you is now a culmination of several years of work on our behalf, working with experts, looking at studies that have been done. Most recently, and most probably importantly, the Canadian study that was a 2-year effort to look at this very issue that's before you. I think the fact that that has occurred and been completed in the time frame that we've been looking at this indicates the moving nature of this problem and the challenges associated with noise from wind turbines. The conclusion that we have reached is that anything under 46 decibels dBA is protective of public health, and I emphasize public health here. So we believe that you have the right standard, but the measurement of this has been a challenge. The enforceability of it has been a challenge. And so what we have proposed to you in the rule is to use a model-based approach that verifies a model after construction and uses that to identify the actual turbine noise on a very short-based time frame basis so that we are measuring the noise from the turbine and see whether it complies or not. The other important feature here is to really encourage the board to only do an exterior standard. An interior standard has proven unworkable for us for a variety of reasons, and also complicates the measurement and enforceability of the issue. Again, this is health only. I want to say that we recognize there is an annoyance factor here, but from the studies that we have seen, the annoyance factor is not based on a particular noise level. It is based instead on other attributes of seeing and being a neighbor to the wind turbines. I think that those are best dealt with by other techniques such as buyouts, easement purchases, or frankly, if the regulatory structure allows, direct benefit to the affected homeowners from the project. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'll turn this over to Dr. Chris Olson. We'll talk first about the health effects and the studies that have been done, and then we'll hear from Payam Astiani on the modeling piece. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, board members. My name is Chris Olson. I hold a PhD in environmental health sciences, and over the last decade, part of my practice has been in understanding potential health issues living around renewable energy projects. You can go to the next slide. During that time, I've worked with a number.
As you go through the slides, could you please say which number slide you're on for the record so that people, when they're reading the record, will be able to follow the slides along with the record?
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. So I'm on slide 2 right now. This looks like a busy slide. What this is to indicate to the board is that not only am I an environmental health consultant, I also hold a number of academic positions, and I believe it's key to peer review publish in this field while I'm here speaking to you about this. So these are the 6 peer-reviewed publications in scientific journals that I and research colleagues have published over the years. They form part of the basis of the opinion that I'm providing you here today. Move to slide 3, please. So when engaged with the Vermont Public Services Department, that engagement really started a couple of years ago. I appeared in front of this board back a couple of years ago talking in general about health. When I was re-engaged to specifically look at your setting a new sound rule, worked with the department to understand what it was that they were going to propose. So I did not propose a sound level to them. They told me what they were looking at, and the question was, is that going to be acceptable, or is it protected from a health basis? So these are some of the understandings that I have of the PSD's proposal, that one, it would be a 45 decibel sound level on an A-rated scale. We'll talk a little bit about at the exterior of a home, that these permissible sound levels could be waived only through sound easement, waiver, or property buyout agreement, that they're not proposing an interior sound standard, and I fully support and agree with that. As part of the preparation for this, I did submit, on behalf of the PSD, they submitted a more lengthy report that provides much more detail than I will in the presentation today. So the projects are going to be required to sound model in order to determine that they will be at 45 decibels or less prior to operation. This is a very common thing across North America and around the world, in fact, in siting wind projects, that post-construction monitoring is going to have to occur. That means that the developers will have to demonstrate that 45 decibels is 45 decibels and not exceeding that on the basis that Mr. Ashtiani will talk to you about later on. And I'm fully supportive and really believe that that is an important part of this. If you have a rule and people are going to construct projects, they should be able to demonstrate they're in compliance with your sound rule. And that also there'll be a complaint resolution process. If we can go to slide 4, I believe it is now. So in brief, when you're charged with the difficult task as a board. I mean, setting a sound rule for wind turbines has become very controversial across North America. And what I would encourage the board to do is to look at the weight of the scientific evidence. There'll be a lot of papers that are presented, a lot of different evidence, anecdotal and the like that comes up and arises. But when we look at the overall scientific merit and the weight of the evidence, there's over 75 peer-reviewed papers and studies now in journal articles. And properly cited wind projects are not resulting in adverse health effects. And I believe that 45 decibels is a properly cited project. But where are the concerns? There are concerns. You wouldn't be setting a sound rule if there were not concerns. They revolve around the audible noise, the sound you hear. That's that dBA scale that we'll be spending, I'm sure, a lot of time talking about today. Low frequency noise and infrasound, which your sound rule at this point, or the proposed rule by the PSD, doesn't have explicit guidelines for, and I'll take you through why I believe that that's okay and appropriate. What are the other measures of health that could be impacted? The Commissioner talked about annoyance and then quality of life. Go to the next slide. So this is the Health Canada study. There's been a lot of discussion about the Health Canada study over the last couple of years. It's the largest study that was undertaken around the world. It was started in 2012. It was completed in 2014. And as of today, there are 8 peer-reviewed publications that the 20-member panel of the Health Canada research team and 5 independent experts from around the world have published in peer-reviewed journals. They looked at self-reported measures of health, which is a common, and annoyance, which is a common tool and vehicle that has been used over the last decade in this field of research. But for the first time, really looked at then also direct measures of health. They looked at things like blood pressure. They took hair cortisol to look at stress levels in people. They did sleep tests and the like, and actually then really studied what the physiological basis for these issues are. And really at the end of the day, they found that with 46 decibels or less, 820 feet was the closest home to an existing turbine in the project, that there was not an association between self-reported or measured determinants of health. And why 46? That just happens to be the loudest sound level and a setback based on setback and proximity that people had to their homes. So I'm not saying it's a bright line that over 46 things are bad, it's just they didn't have measurements over 46 decibels at people's homes. I think that's important. When you move to the next slide, which I believe is, I've lost track now, it's 5 maybe?
6.
6, okay, so we'll talk about sleep first, because and if we go to the next slide on 7, the key to any environmental noise source is ensuring protection of sleep. There is some unwanted annoyance that you get from any sound emission, but really what we're trying to do from a health perspective, first and foremost, is protect your sleep. If you do not get a good night's sleep one night, that can be troublesome. If you have prolonged sleep disturbance, it leads to a host of direct health impacts. This is the top here is the journal article published by Health Canada. Dr. Michaud is the primary researcher, and it was their very extensive study on effects of wind turbine noise on self-reported and objective measures of sleep. The table that you have there is also in the paper. I know it's a little bit hard to read, but essentially what they did was they divided up, like pretty much all of the health research in wind turbines, they divided up into bins of sound levels 30 to 35, 35 to 40, 45 to 46, 40 to 46. And what that table essentially says is that regardless of what the sound level was at the exterior of the home, there was no difference in both self-reported sleep as well as the objective measure of sleep. And the way that they did the objective measure of sleep was they fitted out people with actimeters. They essentially look like Fitbits, fancy Fitbits or wristwatches that you wear over a period of sleep, and it actually measures your actual sleep and the prevalence of sleeping, the disturbance in the sleep. And they saw no difference whether you lived very close to the turbine or you lived out to 10 kilometers away. If we go to the next slide, which would be now slide 8. Other research that's done, I mean, I can't possibly show it to you all now, but this is another commonly cited and very exhaustive project. This was self-reported sleep that was measured by Backer and colleagues. You'll see Dr. Pedersen there, very common name in a lot of the early publications out of Europe, her research team. And what this table 7 from their paper shows is that whether, this is, if we look at the rural column in the Netherlands, it shows people who were awakened or disturbed by different sound sources that disturb their sleep. And the sort of second column there, you can see that around 70% weren't disturbed at all, or reported being disturbed, about 12% by people animal noise, about 12.5% on traffic mechanical sound, and about 6% by wind turbines. So does it cause some disturbance? Well, yes, because there is a sound there, but it's no different, and in fact lower than other sources of noise that we're commonly exposed to in rural areas. Go to the next slide, which would be slide 9. So let's talk about low frequency noise and infrasound, and we go to slide 10. So what about low frequency sound and infrasound? Is it emitted from wind turbines? There was some notion that somehow people didn't believe that it was that developers, others would say it wasn't emitted. It is emitted. It's a sound source that does emit low frequency noise and infrasound. The question is it at a level that poses a health challenge or concern? And I would put to you that no, it's not, with the audible sound levels that you have. So if you set an audible sound limit, or a dBA, in this case being proposed by the PSD at 45 decibels, will it be sufficient to also protect on low frequency noise and infrasound that you experience? I believe that the answer is yes. Go to the next slide. For the court report, I'm going to step away from the microphone just for a second. This looks like a very busy slide, but it actually is fairly simple. So if we look at this slide, this is from a German study that was just recently released by a German state agency, where they took low frequency sound and infrasound measurements around a host of turbines in the German state. And to give you definitions, so low frequency noise is on a frequency from about 20 hertz and up to about 200 hertz. And over 200 hertz, that's where we're talking more on the audible sound. It's A-weighted, sound we typically refer to. So you can hear low frequency sounds. It goes from 20 to about 100. Once you get from 20 hertz and below, that's where we're into the infrasound region. This band here, this pink band, is the measurements that were taken around wind turbines. So that's infrasound and low frequency noise emitted from turbines at about 300 meters away, so about 1,000 feet, okay, from the turbines. So what are all these other lines? So everybody who drove here today, that's the infrasound and low frequency noise you experience being in your car, okay? This line here is if you are living or you're near a roadway that has 2,000 cars an hour. So if you're by the 89 there, living around there, that's the low frequency noise and infrasound there. This is oil heating in the home. And this is the perception threshold. So you can see that these levels here, we're not hearing them. We're not perceiving them. And the infrasound is this, you can't hear it, but is it cause of concern? And what we look at is the international guidelines. There's very few, but this is the level here on the international guidelines. We're well below the international standards for low frequency noise and infrasound. We're well below an issue of concern, and that these are levels that would be less than what you would experience if you set a 45 decibel A-weighted sound level. If you go to the next slide, which is slide 12, this is a research paper that I published with colleagues, one of which is in the room, Mr. Ashtiani, who will be talking to you later today, Jeff Leventhal from the United Kingdom, who's largely considered an international expert in low frequency noise and infrasound. And what we were basically looking at there was taking these measurements of low frequency noise and infrasound, looking at the distances away, looking at the A-weighted sound levels, and did the A-weighted sound levels protect, and were the corresponding low frequency noise and infrasound low enough to be below health concern? And the answer is yes. If we go to slide 13 now, just some other measurements taken by others. This is a paper by Chris Turnbull and colleagues in Australia. The important part here is that you've got on the right-hand column that's the infrasound levels, and they're measured on reported on a dBg scale instead of the dBA scale. So what he and his colleagues did was they went to 2 wind farms. You can see with the meter, the 85 meters, 185 meters, 365 meters. So somewhere around around 200 feet out to just over 1,000 feet from the wind turbines. You start at about 72 dBg at the first wind farm, getting it to 61. If you look at the second one at 330 feet, you're at 66. around 700 feet, you're at 63. And then when you look at the ambient, it's at 62. And then the others are different sources that have nothing to do with wind turbines. If you're at a beach house, 25 meters from the high water line, 75 dBg, et cetera, as we go through. So what this is really showing is similar to that graph that I showed you before. Yes, there is infrasound coming from turbines, but it's no different, and it's in fact usually lower than what we'd experience from many other common noise sources. If we go to the next slide, which is 14, so other potential health issues, and I'll try to move a little quicker now. Go into the next one. Again, this is another paper out of that series of 8 that Health Canada has published. And what this was looking at, again, was both the physical measures of health that they examined, as well as the self-reported lengthy questionnaire about how people respond to their own health. That what they found was that beyond annoyance, which we spent a little bit of time on, the results did not support an association between the wind turbine noise of 46 decibels or less and the evaluated health endpoints. So this is, again, in your paper that I provided to you. So if we were just to look at the health worse versus last year, which is the second line down there under the N, again, you can see that they grouped the people, and there was over 1,200 participants in this study from 12 different wind projects. You'll see that, the numbers there are the percentages that are reporting, the number of people, and then in brackets is the percentages. And you'll see that if I was to go to the sort of 40 to 46, on the right there, you'll see the numbers 51 and 21.8. And if you come back, so that's 21.8% reported that their health was worse versus last year. If you come back to the very far left, at the left less than 25 column, you see that 20%. And statistically, which is that value on the other end, there is no difference between any of the reportings there, although the numbers are slightly different. In all of these issues that they looked at that are commonly raised around wind projects, none of them had a significant difference between being either far away or close in. We go to the next slide, which is 17. We'll spend a few minutes on annoyance. We'll go to 18. Again, I recognize that it's hard to read on the slide. It was just there as an indicator. You go back to the report that prepared. And so when we look at the annoyance, and this is something that comes up a lot, we do try to reduce annoyance around environmental noise sources. But the question is, what is that annoyance related to? And that list in that table is all the different things that people reported as potentially causing their annoyance with the wind turbines. And when they ran multiple regression, very crazy statistical models that are very complex, really only about 9% of the annoyance could be explained by the wind turbine noise. We know this is nothing new. We've known from the early research out of Europe over the last decade that what is the larger source or cause of annoyance is visual cue, community attitude towards the projects. If you have good buy-in from a community, then you have very few, if ever, noise complaints. If you have not good buy-in by communities or other issues in play, then you can experience more annoyance. So really setting a sound rule, whether it's 45 decibels, 40 decibels, or even 35 decibels, you're not going to be able to take that visual aspect away with those different sound levels. So really it's finding a way to deal with the annoyance outside of the sound levels is what I would propose.
Mr. Olson, just one question clarifying the slide. And the quote on the right-hand side, and province, does that mean actual physical location?
Yeah, so sorry, what happened there was Health Canada did their study in 2 provinces, one Ontario, where I'm from, and then also in Prince Edward Island, because they're 2 very different provinces, and PEI actually was one of the first provinces to get a lot of wind turbines. And what they found was the annoyance in Ontario was quite a bit higher than it was in Prince Edward Island, even though the turbines may have been closer and or potentially even elevated noise levels. So they didn't go as far as to state that it was that heightened level of concern. In Ontario, as the Green Energy Act came into play in around 2009 up until a couple of years ago, there was a lot of media attention, a lot of concern about projects being brought in that may have been the cause. But we certainly know that from the international research, the more community acceptance, the less annoyance in the community reports. We go to the next slide, which is 19. These are the supporting government documents and studies that I've also listed for you in the report that I prepared for the PSD to submit to you. So you don't just trust me. There are, This has been examined by a number of medical agencies, a number of state agencies, and it is quite well researched, I would say at this point. And the conclusion slide, so to boil it all down, what I would put to you that is, if I was standing here 5 years ago even, there would not be anywhere near the breadth and depth of the research that has been published in the last 5 years. The Health Canada study certainly is a foundation for a lot of this, but there's numerous other studies that come to the same conclusion. I would suggest giving the weight of scientific evidence as you consider what you want to do for a sound rule as a board, and I would put to you that 45 decibels, if you were to have a 45 decibel sound standard that's enforceable, that can be measured, that you can actually come back and say this is what 45 decibels means, then I believe that it would be protective of public health. With that, thank you, board members. I think Mr. Ashtiani was going to come up and give you the sound side of things, and then we'd be happy to maybe go into more detail if you'd like.
Can we ask questions now or after both of them have spoken?
Why don't you go ahead right now?
My question is about...
Excuse me, may I have your name, please?
My name is Greg Pierce. I'm a retired professional engineer. My question is kind of a two-part, but they intertwine. Factor of safety is a consideration that engineers always engage in when designing sophisticated works like bridges, depth of pavement. They do the numbers and come up with a basic model, and then they add a factor of safety for what can't be known. Within this wind program, I've looked at the Freedom, Maine wind ordinance, and they have a setback distance. Now, they don't say expressly what the purpose of that is, but clearly it's a factor of safety in relation to the numerical values that they set forth in their ordinance. Does this ordinance have or the proposal that the Department of Public Service is putting forward, does it have a setback distance to protect as a factor of safety against the unknown?
Yeah, so I'll try to answer it multi-part back. So there is no proposed setback distance, from my understanding, from the department. Now, ordinances and state regulations vary quite a bit across the U.S. Sometimes they are distance setbacks, sometimes they are sound setbacks, and sometimes they're a combination of both. So very commonly in the Midwest, for example, you'll have a 50 decibel sound limit and a 1,000-foot or 1,400-foot setback distance. In other jurisdictions, you'll have further setback distances, and some, again, stay at about 1,000. From a health standpoint, it's multifold. So for what we've been discussing here today is not the physical harm, health and safety, so ice or blade throw, but I can come back to that later. It's on the protection of sleep, protection of those intangible health factors, and we do the same thing on that, very much so, the same thing on the health side. We don't just set a limit and say, okay, here it is, and then a decibel or two above that, then you're going to be into that impairment. And that's why I'm saying the 46 decibels where Health Canada did that, it wasn't that anything over that is bad, it's just that we know that if we're that or less in this research that it's safe. There is, I would put to you, there is a safety factor built in there with the 46 decibels. Where we do know in environmental health and environmental noise is that you should not be going above 55 decibels for sure. World Health Organization, other jurisdictions, the US EPA, you go beyond 55, we know that we very much are going to be crossing that bright line. In terms of setback distance, it could be something that the board could consider. At 45...
Do you recommend it, in fact?
In fact, I don't. And the reason that I don't is because I'm more concerned about making sure that the sound standard is appropriate and that it's enforceable and that it can be demonstrated the project's in compliance. The give or take setback distance for 45 decibels is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 feet or more. It would be challenging to design a project. It may be as close as 1,500, but you'd be at a fair distance back, and certainly distances beyond which we'd be concerned about physical health and safety from ice throw or any of the like. So if the board was going to consider a setback distance, then I would encourage them to look at the research that shows based on a sound level, what approximate distance. Because you could have a project that, let's say, has 2 turbines, and the sound level with 45 decibels could be actually, the distance to a home could be quite a bit closer. If you have a project of 15 or 20 wind turbines. The way that they model it is if the wind's coming in all directions from each of those turbines at a home, and that has to be 45 decibels, and you might be at setback distances that are quite a bit closer. So really it's the sound level that we want to make sure that's first and foremost protecting sleep, and then all the other potential cascading effects.
Question too.
Sure, why don't you go first?
I guess in the interest of,
Identify yourself, please.
oh, I'm sorry, John Brabant, Vermonters for a Clean Environment. In the interest of full disclosure, could you please first inform us as the audience here and the board as to whether or not you have been an expert, hired expert for any wind energy company? And if so, which companies? And are you currently working for any wind energy companies? And in the future, do you anticipate consulting to or providing expert witness testimony on behalf of wind energy developers?
Yes, and so the reason I'm flipping through, this is what I have in my hands right now for the court reporter is the report that I prepared for the board that was publicly disclosed on the website. I believe my CV is also part of the full submission of that. But if the board was to turn to page 3 of the report, it then starts to go and list the different tribunals, legal proceedings, and hearings that have been formally qualified as an expert in health in relation to wind turbines. It lists the companies and the locations. So in general, I do quite a bit of work for wind developers. I also hold independent academic research positions, and peer review publish the information. In this case, I was hired by the state agency, but certainly have appeared in front of a number of boards, commissions, and hearings on that. Companies such as NextEra, Apex, Suncor, Samsung, and the like. So there's a host, and yes. So do I anticipate to continue to work with wind developers? Yes. One of the reason I do is that trying to help them safely site projects, looking at the international peer-reviewed literature, looking at that coming to conclusions, coming and testifying in front of boards like this, and ultimately, the question is what is my reputation? Am I just a paid industry shill? No, I mean, this is what I do for a living. I hold a PhD in environmental health. If I believe that the setbacks or the sound levels should be lower, that is the number that I would propose and say. So yes, I do anticipate working for state agencies as I have in the past, working for governments, working for developers. Ultimately, my opinion doesn't change regardless of who pays.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Keith Ballack from Sheffield, and my question to you is, the data that you've collected here, is it terrain specific, or are you just taking a whole bunch of averages from all different types of projects, be it out in a field or out in the, off the coast? How do you come up with these averages?
Yes, so sorry, Commissioner.
No, that's okay. Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
after Dr. Olson answers that, may I have a moment to address that as well?
Sure.
Thanks.
So yes, I mean, I'm certainly well aware that in Vermont, a number of your projects are located on ridges, right, and on ridge lines. And the data that's been collected around the world, and that's why one study's not sufficient, 2 studies aren't sufficient. That's why we need a weight of scientific evidence. If you look at, for example, the Health Canada study, you have everything from very flat land in Prince Edward Island. If any of you have ever been there, it is flat as flat can be. It doesn't get any flatter than it does in that little island. In Ontario, you've got a mix of ridge lines, you have farm fields. New Zealand and Australia, where some of this research comes out of, it's very much really on. So it's a variety of different mixes of projects. And just if I can just close out, and then I'm certainly happy to. And that's why I suggest a setback distance, for example, is not a good proxy for making sure protection of health. It's making sure that the sound level is going to be at that level or less. And Mr. Ashtiani could talk more about the modeling and how that occurs. But so one is that you have to make sure that that sound level is low enough. But number 2 is that's the demonstration of compliance after. So if there's something unique about an individual project, that's why post-construction monitoring to demonstrate its compliance is critical.
It's terrain specific.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, no, the health side is level specific. The modeling or the way that the sound carries and moves is terrain specific.
All right, I'll finish up really quick. The reason I say this, reason I'm questioning this, is I've visited numerous times neighbors of mine who've been forced from their home in Sheffield. And I can tell you right now, you can go over there, and if the conditions are right, it can go on for days. If the wind's coming from a certain direction, you can be standing upright, and you can hear this noise, this throbbing that goes on and on. You put your head down to hip level, and it's like the bedrock is transmitting the noise. And I can understand why they can't sleep at night, because you're sleeping maybe 18 inches from the floor. So this is being transmitted through the bedrock, part of it is. And I think the shape of the terrain is also funneling it in. And you've got to take that into consideration too.
I'll let Mr. Ashtiani speak to that, but I don't believe it is being transferred to the bedrock.
Well, it's louder when you put your head down. I just can tell you that.
The sound expert's probably best to answer that part, and I'll let him do so.
Mr. Recchia?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Chris Recchia, Commissioner of Public Service. These are good questions. They're perfectly valid, but they are kind of getting beyond the health issue and into more the modeling issue. So with your indulgence, I'd really recommend that we hear from Mr. Astiani and then make both available so we get the right person answering the question, okay? Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well,
Assuming your question's about health.
my
May I have your name, please?
my name is Dion Yermega from Starksboro, Vermont. If the standard is
Can you
30
stand up, please? It's easier to hear you.
if the standard is 35 decibels, or is less than the standard in Vermont, state of Vermont, 35 decibels in Germany, the terrain is flat. Here in Vermont, we have varied terrain and we have extreme varied climate. It's not like the climate in Germany. Our decibel level, what's 46?
45 is being proposed.
45.
And the German standard is not 35.
What is it?
The German standard varies, I'd have to check. It's between 40 and 45, I believe, depending on the jurisdiction in the state.
Well, in
It's not
Germany,
35.
in Europe, they have over 600 groups that are fighting against the annoying sound. And there are, University of Portugal is studying heart-related issues concerning wind turbines.
That's the vibroacoustic disease, and it's not actually University of Portugal, I'd have to look it up, but that is vibroacoustic disease, and if you wanted to just, I guess I'd look to the board, if you want to have, how do you want to go back and forth on this, or do you want?
We're talking about health too.
I'm happy to answer, I just want to make sure that, like, to what level?
Maybe a general level?
Okay, so, again, with the vibroacoustic disease, that's Dr. Alves Pereira, and it's a small research group out of Europe, and they weren't initially attaching that or vibroacoustic disease to wind turbines. They were doing it with its other issues that they were looking at. It is not a recognized medical condition. They're the only group that actually recognizes that as even being a condition, let alone dealing with it. And so I'm just looking through the report here to find the reference to it. It has been heard before courts and tribunals in the past. It's never been upheld in North America as being an issue. They studied one child and one family for a couple of days back in 2008. It is not credible research or science, I would put you, sir.
So if you have all these other states that have done all these studies about the safety of the sound, why doesn't the state of Vermont Health Department do any other health studies within our state? We have a different type of terrain, we have different type of circumstances. Is this being done?
I can't speak for the state health department. What I can tell you is that these studies are actually very expensive. I would have to defer to the state health department, but commonly we don't do these as individual states and individual studies like this. You look at that bulk of the literature from around the world to see whether or not it would be warranted here. And I would suggest that given the breadth of the international literature, the state of Vermont wouldn't need to do their own specific
studies. Well, it seems like we
studies.
have plenty of subjects. If we are approving these projects without studies, then why are we doing this?
Well, again, you wouldn't be approving it without studies, that international body of literature. For example, if you're a Vermonter and you need to have a heart transplant, you're not going to do medical research in Vermont as to the best way necessarily how to do that heart transplant. You are going to go to the international literature, you're going to go to that international working and body. If you're going to your physician for asthma, they're not going to prescribe a drug that was tested solely on Vermonters. When we deal with medical health, environmental health related issues, we deal with it from that broader scope of the literature and then try to apply it as reasonable into individual areas.
Well, if these other states have done either studies, why aren't we doing it?
So
I don't think this witness can
yeah,
answer
so that would have to lead to the public.
I cannot, we can't speak for the other agencies of state government. You should direct your question to the Department of Health if you would like to find out. So we're ready to go to the next presenter, and then we'll have questions for both presenters at that point.
All right, everyone can hear me okay? I'll assume yes. Hi everyone, my name is Payam Ashtiani. I work for Air Acoustics Engineering Limited. We're an engineering consulting firm based out of Toronto, Canada. Consulting on acoustics, noise and vibration since about 1974. Been involved in renewable projects, modeling, measurements, research over the past 10 years or so, or 15 years or so. And here we're just going to, my focus on this talk is about once you set a limit for sound levels coming from a wind turbine facility, how do you measure them, and how do you know with certainty what the actual impacts are? Excellent. So, slide number 2. So the first thing I always like to do is differentiate between two commonly used terms in this field, and they both sound the same. One's called noise emission, and the other one is noise emission, and they basically sound the same, but one of them has an E and the other one has an I. Emission with an E is about the noise emitted by a source, be it a tractor, a lawnmower, a wind turbine, or whatever. It's about the sound emanating from an individual source. Emission with an I, or I emission as some people like to refer to it, is about the sound that impinges on a receiving location, but be it a dwelling or otherwise. Next slide, please. So, and you can click. So, if you're talking about noise emission, you've got a turbine, and go to the next. One more. And if you're measuring the sound coming from the turbine, it's called emission. But if that sound is near the house, that's noise emission with an I. And usually that's where people are interested in knowing what the sound level is. The main difference is that at the house, it's not just the one turbine. It's all of the individual turbines in the facility, as well as other sources of noise that may contaminate and otherwise affect the levels measured. Keep going. So we're at slide number 3. And I just wanted to have a quick section on pre-construction noise modeling, which would be involved in the permitting phase. Next slide. So slide number 4. 5, sorry. Keep going. So there's industry-accepted methodology that agrees well with post-construction measurements in general. Keep going. Modeling methods should be standardized and prescribed so that once a model is used, everybody uses it the same way. They developed and use appropriate parameters within that modeling so that it's consistent between projects. There is a guide in the UK done by the Institute of Acoustics. It's called the Institute of Acoustics Good Practice Guide, published in May 2013. Basically, it shows that the ISO 9613-2 modeling standard is widely accepted and validated, but that the modeling parameters are important. And the modeling parameters in there, the most important one probably is the ground factor, to be set at 0.5 or less. This is like modeling the ground as a semi-porous ground, in that even though you may have grass fields, it may not be completely absorbing the sound. There's a certain fraction of it that would get reflected, and 0.5 is indicative of half of the sound being reflected and half of the sound being absorbed every time the sound hits the ground. The temperature and humidity would need to be set. The sound power input used. Now, the sound power is sound emission with an E that we spoke about earlier. It's about what the actual machine generates. And there are details in that guidelines about uncertainty considerations and what kind of safety factors to put in depending on what kind of data you get from a manufacturer. And also there's considerations for other topographical conditions like concave ground or concave topography, like in a valley or in probably in a lot of cases that you get in Vermont. Keep going. So those are the factors that the department, or we're proposing the department say that are important when looking at the pre-construction portion of that sample. When it comes to post-construction noise monitoring, the things that are important are about. It's usually done in the stage where you're doing either commissioning for a recently completed wind farm or in response to a noise complaint. And the important thing is to get a really good sense of what the noise from the wind turbines is and what impact it has at the receivers. Now, when we started doing, when we started going at this problem, it was about over a decade ago, and we first started. Can you click? Okay. We first started circa 2005-2007 with putting simple noise monitors out over short term. We found that really didn't give us the granularity. Then in 2007-2008, we started doing attended measurements, short to medium term. So we'd go out there when we thought the conditions were right, do some measurements, and then we found that, well, how do you know when the conditions are exactly right? And we spent all this energy but didn't actually get those conditions that the complaint was complaining about. And it's about 2008 and 2010 we started getting into more sophisticated unattended noise monitors that got put in the field for a longer term time. And this was so that we could actually get those conditions that the thing that a noise consultant always hears is, you should have been here last night. Right, so the idea was you have to put the units out there, but they have to be sophisticated enough to be able to capture what's there. 2011 to present is basically when we've been refining that system. There are more robust systems now. They're cell-connected so that we can remotely monitor the sound levels. And if there's bad nights or specific nights, we can pull the data remotely without having to continue going to the units and fetching the data. And that's enabled us to do analysis in more robust ways and also develop something in the last couple of years is more objective algorithms for detecting tonality and tonal components. These are whines if there's a gearbox that's making more noise than it's supposed to, or if something's wrong with the blade or whatnot. So the recommendations here are really informed by the past decade of our measurement experience, and all of these are for large wind turbines. They're not for little small ones because the dynamics are a bit different. Next slide. We're on slide number.
This is slide 8.
Slide number 8. So this part I'm going to go a bit quick. The instrumentation side that we've made in our recommendation is not all that different from what most experts use in the field right now. We're calling for a Class 1 sound level meter, which provides the highest level of accuracy with a microphone. We're recommending a secondary windscreen for added protection against wind-induced pseudonoise. So in that photo, if you see the mast, the yellow mast, about halfway through there's a black ball. That's what we've made as a secondary windscreen. So there's a regular windshield that goes on microphones, but then there's also a secondary 18 to 24 inch ball that we've made that also increases the amount of protection you'll get from just wind going over the microphone and making pseudonoise, kind of like that kind of noise. There's also an anemometer there. In this particular example, it's at a height of 10 meters because this one happens to be in Ontario, where the regulations require that the wind speed be measured at a 10-meter height. But that could be at a microphone height. The point is you need the environmental information where or very close to where the microphone is, and that includes wind speed, wind direction, temperature, humidity, pressure, and the occurrence of precipitation like rain. Next slide. So the next aspect is the location. Preferably the location that gets picked as part of a commissioning measurement should be in the location of the highest predicted impact from the facility, located where one could reasonably expect downwind conditions to occur more frequently than others, and a location that's free of significant sources of contamination, such as busy roadways, heavily shrubbed or forested areas, or close to other commercial operations. So to give you an idea of how this works, click. You've got, I've made a little example of what looks like a ridgeline kind of layout. Here we go. And you've got houses all around, and then you look at your historic windrows. That gives you the direction that historically the wind blows from. And you look at the one that's got the most downwind probability house. You pick that one, and then you can put your microphone and anemometer, but not necessarily the only one. If you look at that windrows, although it looks like from the northwest direction is the absolute highest percentage direction. If you look at the southwest direction, in this particular case, there's a reasonable amount of time that happens too. So you could theoretically pick either that house or the house that's to the north of it, which would also maybe be reasonably expected to be downwind, or maybe you pick both. The idea though is you look at what is reasonably expected so that you can get the condition that would cause the highest impact, and pick those locations. Next slide. We're on slide number 10 now. The next part is data filtering. What we're recommending is that measurements be done in 1 minute intervals, meaning that every minute you get your wind speed information, your sound level information, your direction, and you look at your entire data set in 1 minute chunks. The reason for this is illustrated in this figure. So in this figure, the red graph is the sound level measured over an hour. The x-axis here is time. And these are individual 1 minute intervals going from the beginning of the hour on the left to the end of the hour on the right. And the blue graph is the wind speed. And again, in this case, it's at a 10-meter height, but it's from the beginning to the end. And you can see that about, I don't know, a fifth of the way you get that spike in the red curve. That is an extraneous event, so I don't know, somebody slamming a door or a car passing by or whatnot. And so getting measurements in 1 minute intervals allows you to throw those data sets out because they're just contaminating the noise. But in addition to that, looking at the variation within the hour, you've got a wind speed that goes, and the wind speeds are on the right part of the axis, goes from 4 meters a second all the way to 7 meters a second. And so the ambient condition can change wildly from a less windy situation to a more windy situation. And the sound level, if you take out those individual spikes, it goes from something like 40 decibels when the wind speed is around 4 meters to around 45 to maybe 50 decibels. Yeah, 50 decibels when it's 7 meters a second. So if you had measurements that span the whole hour, you would get one data point essentially describing this whole hour. And you don't really know if that's the noise from the turbines or noise from contamination. You know that the wind speed was low at some point, but it was high at other points. And it doesn't allow you the right amount of granularity to be able to tease the good part of the data from the contaminated part of the data. Next slide. Keep going. So, one more. So, for us to, once we look at 1 minute intervals, we also look at data points that are valid for use in the analysis. And for a data point to be valid, we're saying that there needs to be no precipitation during that interval. We would like to separate daytime from nighttime because of different fauna conditions. You'll get birds during the daytime, but not at night, and vice versa. You want to ensure that the turbines themselves are operating at a high noise output. So you only look at times when the SCADA system from the wind farm gives you an interval where you know that the power was being generated near maximum, and so sound was being generated near maximum. And you look at wind direction that is not upwind. So some people like to only look at data that is downwind only. Sometimes that gets a bit restrictive in the amount of times that are applicable, and so we're suggesting that downwind or crosswind is acceptable as being part of that data set. And the wind speed measured at the ground level is less than 5 meters a second to minimize ambient noise. And of course, on top of that, you have to remove intervals that with transient events such as car pass-bys, etc. Once we look at this kind of methodology, then it's not about going over a specific hour or a specific time interval. It's about having sufficient number of data points in each of those conditions to be able to make conclusions of. So there's a requirement to obtain sufficient number of valid data points for both with the turbines on and parked or off. The data is then binned by wind speed, and the on and off are compared, and a determination is made of the turbine contribution through a logarithmic subtraction of the two. Keep going. Let's speed it up a little bit.
Slide 13.
Slide 13, yep, keep going. So once we do that, we get a data set like this. On the x-axis, you've got wind speed going from 2 meters a second to 9. And on the y-axis, you've got sound levels all the way from 20 decibels to 55. And the blue dots are sound levels with the turbines on, and the red dots are with the turbines off. This data has been filtered for all of the items that I described in the previous one, except for the power filter. So in this situation, you've got sound levels that are measured by wind speed for all the conditions. So if the turbines were down for maintenance, or if the wind wasn't quite right at the hop height and the sound wasn't maximized, they're all still in here. Once you put that power filter, this is now a different data set where that power filter has been applied. You get a situation where you still have your ambient noise and your turbine noise basically the same level once you get to 5 meters a second and above, meaning that at that point something is contaminating the noise and your ambient and your turbine noise are basically the same. But below that you start to get a very clear separation in the sound levels measured with the turbines operating and with the turbines off. And that really is the crux of the situation we're after. We're after times when the ground level wind speed is at the lowest and the hop height wind speed is at near maximum. So you've got a situation where there's very low amount of ambient noise from trees or from other noises that are related in the immediate vicinity, but also at times when the turbines themselves would be making the maximum noise. That's your best shot at getting a good signal of noise. It's also the highest shear condition. So this would be a condition where if you've got a ridgeline project, the turbines at the top are going to be spinning at full blast, and at the dwelling in the valley, there's absolutely no wind to mask any of that sound. So the impact is the highest, and it gives us the best shot of being able to know what the actual contribution from the turbines are. The other part about this is that no one individual data point can be relied upon as not being affected by ambient. What you really have to look at is the spread, and so you've got a variation with the turbines operating and a variation with the ambient. And you can never really know for each individual data point what the ambient was, but when you look at the trend, that's when you'll be able to say the impact from this wind facility is, in this case, you take a mean of between 36 and 40 and say, okay, it's 38, for example. There's going to be some times when it's slightly higher and sometimes where it's slightly lower, but that's probably the best way you can quantify the contribution. Keep going. So again, the assessment's based on mean logarithmic averaging, mean or logarithmic averaging of the levels by wind speed. Once you do that filtering, it doesn't really matter all that much. Facility contribution is determined by an ambient correction, and the assessment has to be made with sufficient data that's occurred. So we're suggesting at least 20, but I mean that's up to practicality, the practicality of how often those conditions happen. The two notes I have there is any one individual minute above or below the limit does not constitute an assessment of compliance or non-compliance. And the nature of ambient noise is changing constantly, so it'd be difficult to defend with certainty in knowing like that one individual minute is not unduly influenced by a transient event contamination. I also have a quick thing on tonality. Tonality is about hums and things that whistle, mostly what do you call it, gearboxes. The current working method is to use a 1/3 octave, which is a frequency-based analysis. what we're proposing is something that's a little bit more detailed so that you can pick out the tones and is less prone to false negatives when it comes to identifying tonality. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have a question, I think, for Dr. Olson. I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying we recommend that it be set at 45 and that we not use distance, and so we use actual measurements?
Yeah, so the way that you could consider also applying a distance. If you were going to apply a distance, I would have it a 40.
We use actual measurements?
Yeah, so the way that you could consider also applying a distance. If you were going to apply a distance, I would have it a 40. If 45 was the number that you set on, I would say it would have to be at most 45 decibels and or set back at a certain distance, so that you still have that sound component in there.
But you're not recommending distance.
I'm not.
So I want to focus on what you're recommending.
So on the sound side, what I recommend is that what's currently proposed, what is very common practice, is that if a project's proposed, that they have to model in accordance with your sound rule that's laid out as to how they're to model, to ensure the conservatism that 45 decibels will be 45 decibels on the ground. Then if you were to approve the project, that then the developer would then have to go through the regime that's been discussed on post-construction monitoring to then demonstrate to the board that what they modeled and told you the sound level was going to be is actually what it is on the ground level. And if they are out of compliance, if the models, in my experience, and from, again, Mr. Ashtiani could probably speak better to this, but the models are actually, they tend to be overly conservative because of the factors that are put into them and the different ways that they have inherent conservative features in them. So post-construction monitoring does line up. If it doesn't, they're out of compliance and they'll have to deal with that issue with you and the board.
So, for example, if the terrain in a particular instance caused some type of a funneling effect so that noise was directed towards a particular location in the terrain that might be further away than you would have guessed, that you would have expected the noise to be as loud as it is, but in fact it is that loud at that spot, then they would not be in compliance.
That's right, and maybe what I would put to you is that, in my mind, it is up to the developer to make sure that they have done what they need to do to convince themselves that at the ground level, at a dwelling, they would be 45 decibels or less. That you would be, as a board, approving these applications if you believe that they were in compliance with your modeling methodology. But ultimately, the real number is not the modeled number, it is having to demonstrate compliance on the ground.
Right, so, okay, and so after they build the project and we do the tests, if in fact it's louder than they thought it would be in certain homes, then it's the developer's risk that they would have to dial back their operations.
That would be what I would suggest to you would be appropriate, because
Okay.
you're setting a limit, they know what the rules are that you're setting, they need to demonstrate to you that you're doing that, and if there are projects, I can tell you, there are projects where I have been involved, where for whatever reason, an individual turbine or the home placement, there has been demonstrated compliance. Typically, it's been because there's been a gearbox or some sort of mechanical issue with the turbine, it's fixed, and then they're back into compliance. But no, there are projects where they've had to be curtailed because nighttime curtailments, for example, or the like, because they were not in compliance with the regulation.
Even though they thought they would?
Even though they thought they
based on
would?
the design, the earlier studies?
Absolutely,
Okay,
sir. Yep.
right, thanks. Yes?
My name's Paula Kane. I'm from St. Albans. I just would like some clarification. You started off your talk by saying you were asked to evaluate a 45 decibel sound standard. Is that correct?
Sorry, originally what I was asked to do was, yes, to look at here's what the proposed standard was that under the interim
Which
law,
was 45.
which was 45, and so I
So
started
you
there.
didn't start from zero to look for an ideal standard.
Well,
Is
no.
that correct?
So what I did was, what I was asked was, is 45 acceptable? And then, so therefore, anything below that would be. So if the board decides to set something lower, or because my understanding is the board is not anticipated looking at a number that is higher than 45, for example. So is 45 sufficient to protect public health? and therefore anything below that would be acceptable.
But you started with their number of 45 and evaluated it.
I did, in this case, yes.
That's my question. Thank you.
And if I understood what you were saying, if you had done a study that was to say what the higher number would be, if there were a higher number that would still be protective of health, you didn't actually study that.
I have in the past,
Oh, you have,
and
okay.
I would put to you that 50 decibels is actually can be an appropriate value depending on a whole host of other factors, but I did not enter that into this discussion because what I was asked for was that I anticipated through the discussions with the PSD that this board would unlikely take a standard and raise it from 45 upwards.
Okay, thanks. Yes.
Hi, I'm Penny Doobie, and my question is, you say 45 decibels. Is that not to exceed 45, or is that an averaging?
So I'm going to maybe come back to Mr. Ashtiani so he can describe to you what the board's looking at for that, because I know there's a lot of discussion around that, so maybe he can describe what they're proposing first on is it a not to exceed, what is the...
It's what the department's proposing.
Oh, sorry, I apologize.
So it all comes back to how that compliance is evaluated. As I showed, that you're always going to get a variation in both the sound level that's predicted and the sound level that's measured. And those models, they predict a given situation, and there's always going to be some uncertainty around that. And so the recommendation that the board, the department is putting forward is so that is a modeled number. So whatever goes into the assumptions of that model, that is what gets evaluated at the end, which would be some level of average around those worst case conditions. So it's not averaged over all time, it's averaged over the times when the impact from the turbines are going to be the maximum.
And the health studies that have been done on that basis. So they're consistent with what Mr. Ashtiani just described. So it's not an average sound level over the course of the year while the turbines are operating. It's a maximum sort of worst case scenario, but it's not that it would never potentially ever be 46 or 47 for a very short period of time at the home, at the dwelling. So it's a worst case and average.
Because one of the things that I've read is average over an hour. That means you really could have peaks and valleys, or average over 10 minutes. So I guess I don't really understand what you're saying that.
Right. So that is the crux of the matter. What's been there so far have been hourly limits, and over an hour the wind speed can vary, the turbine noise output can vary, and so what we found is in order to get a stable sound level from the turbines at the homes, you really need to look at a shorter interval and isolate that. And so if over a course of an hour the ground level wind speed goes from 4 meters a second to 8 meters a second, and the hub height wind speed goes or stays at a given, like a speed where the turbine generates the maximum power, you can look at that time and look at the times when the ground level wind speed is low in 1 minute intervals, so that you don't blend in the whole hour into that average. You're just looking at over 1 minute where the wind speed was constant, the sound from the turbine was constant, and the ambient noise was the least. And that way you're looking at very short-term intervals, but it won't be a situation where you say for that 1 minute, if the sound level was 45, for that 1 minute it was 46, therefore the whole site's non-compliant. It's more about for all the times when the wind speed was low and each individual 1 minute was steady, we took and the wind direction was not upwind, so we're looking at a downwind or crosswind, and the turbines were generating maximum noise. For all of those conditions, that's what we average, and the number in that average is what the assessment is based on. I hope that was a little clearer.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Scott Rodwell. I'm from Rodwell Bioacoustics. I'm here with Pete. I had a couple of questions. First, a comment on the proposal to leave it up to the wind project developer to figure out how to do the modeling and what assumptions to use. My suggestion there would be that the department or the rules clearly establish what those model assumptions should be, And the reason for that is to actually preempt any compliance issues if we can use proven modeling parameters. So I've seen where different consultants use different modeling assumptions and come up with different results. And the mitigation process, if those models are incorrect, can be very cumbersome. So I would encourage you to specify exactly what those modeling parameters are. And I also had a question for Mr.
Before you move on, then?
So in my presentation, I just so as I make it clear, we were recommending the same thing, that the parameters actually be prescribed so that everybody does model in the same way.
Yeah, I thought Mr. Olson had said to leave it up to their discretion. No, that's
No, sorry, what I was saying is that the model, as Mr. Asciani described, that the model has to be done as per the board's considerations, but that ultimately, that the number that has to be demonstrated, so the developer has to take on some of that risk in that if they're not in compliance at a home, at the sound standard, that can't be left entirely to the board. That has to be, the developer has to then look at it and say, okay, am I comfortable with the modeling that's being done here? Because ultimately, the compliance is, my understanding, what the PSD is recommending is not compliant. There's the modeling component, but the compliance is operational data from the wind turbine. So the developers have to be comfortable that ultimately, at the ground level, they are going to be in compliance. If
You're
not,
saying that the developer could choose to do something more restrictive if they aren't comfortable with it?
absolutely, yes. And there are developers that will do that. They have their own risk tolerances by state, by jurisdiction, and they should be the ones taking that on, and company.
I had a question for Mr. Asciani. On the ambient versus turbines on and turbines off, what is the sequencing of that? How long do the turbines stay on? How long does it take to shut turbines off? How long do they stay off? And what are you able to do? Because we've tried to do this here, and because we have to deal with ISO New England and have a sequence for doing this, the time the turbines that you need shut down or shut down, it can be quite a long time because they have to adjust the grid. So can you just explain how you were able to do, how you did that?
Yeah, so my understanding is that the measurements that have been historically done here are ones where there's a cycling of the turbines on and off in order to get ambient and the turbine on conditions. Most of the data that you saw presented was from Ontario, where we do shutdowns for like a whole night. So we'll go a few nights with the turbines on, and we're monitoring what wind conditions we've gotten, and we say, okay, we need to get the ambient conditions between, say, 4 and 5 meters a second, or between 2 and 3 meters a second. And we look at the forecast and we say, okay, tonight looks like a night where that condition is going to occur. Let's just do the shutdown for the entire night tonight. So it's less about what the hour before and the hour after the shutdown was, and more about the trend with the wind turbines on and the trend with the wind turbines off. And once you look at that trend, then you don't need to look at yesterday's ambient versus today's ambient, because you've already isolated the factor that causes that variation, which is short-term increases and decreases in wind speed.
Can I ask one more follow-up? If you have now found out that for certain surface wind speeds, you have to have them at certain, low enough to be able to isolate wind turbines, couldn't you simplify this to some degree and just require that wind turbine sound measurements be made when the surface wind speeds are that low?
Yes, in fact, the recommendation is that only measurements be considered valid when the ground level wind speed is 5 meters a second or below. Now, you could pick 4, we could pick 3, and the lower the better. The most important part for me is that when you're looking at the on and off portions, you look at times where the wind speed was the same. So don't look at an on with
What I'm suggesting is that you don't need to go to the turbines off if you do that. Have you ever looked at it that way?
You mean that once? Yeah, sure. You could look at it. If you can show that without an ambient adjustment, you're already showing compliance when the wind speed is low enough and the power output is high, then yes, you absolutely don't. You don't need to correct for ambient when the total sound is already compliant.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
My question is for
Your name, please?
Eddie Duncan, RSG. My question is for Air Acoustics. I was wondering, if you have a ridge line and wind is running parallel to the ridge line, you can actually, the wind turbine is not the only source on that ridge line at that point. You actually typically have a forest that's going up that ridge line, and that forest itself generates quite a bit of sound. And I'm wondering if the methodology that you described can take that into account, that there's a decent amount of background sound that might not be localized, but rather coming from the ridge line, even when the turbines are and aren't operating.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we haven't done measurements specifically on ridgeline, so I haven't experienced that. But if it is, I mean, what's really important is that you get the same condition on and off. And so if you feel that for a project that is an important consideration, then you should be able to see the hot height anemometry from the turbines even when they're off, just to make sure that that condition maybe occurs and that it's taken account. It's accounted for in the ambient.
Yeah. My name is Sally Colopy from Fairfield, and I might have neglected to see this, Mr. Olson, in your first presentation and Keith covered it, asked the question about topography, but how many, it would have been nice to have it broken down by columns, because studies, to me, don't mean a lot unless I know how many people you studied, what their distances were, and what their various topographies were for all those comparisons as to how they relate. And also, I wonder how many studies have been done over water at close range, because for many of us in Fairfield, we are over Fairfield Pond, and the RSG expert said that you basically have to deduct the water from the distance of the turbines to the home, and we are basically down off the ridge in prevailing southwest winds over water. And I didn't see any studies really over water.
So I'll, again, multiple part question, and let me try to take it apart one at a time. So again, the key for the health side is not so much, and hear me out, let me try to get you there. It's not so much what the model said, what the topography was, what the issues were around individual projects, because what the key is what is the level at people's homes. So if the, and this is where I'm saying, so, and you're right, I mean, I think Mr. Ashton, why don't you touch on the water issue, because right now he's got a ground cover of 0.5, touch on, what you have to do when you have that, and then I'll come back.
Yeah, so the ground cover over the water portion shouldn't be allowed to be modeled as a 0.5. That should be modeled as a completely reflective surface, and that's what we typically do when we have water sources. So the 0.5 was the maximum allowable ground factor in any part, water or otherwise, but not the minimum. So the water would have to be modeled as a completely reflective ground or reflective surface, so that all the sound hitting the water would bounce completely back and then be re-released into the atmosphere and continue down its propagating path. So the models do take into account the different reflecting properties, or they should take into account different properties of ground at different locations. So hopefully that answered that part.
So you're saying that the sound will increase because of the water?
Sound will propagate more efficiently over water. The sound level won't physically increase, but if you're comparing it to the same path with water and without, the path over water will have a higher sound level at that.
And so maybe I'll try to come back to it again then. So there's all different ways to model, and certainly models are good things. We need to model things because you have to have some appreciation for what's going to happen. And this is where I say on the developer, and where I say putting it back, knowing that I work for a number of developers, and this is my opinion, is they have to take on that risk to understand that ultimately at your home or anybody else's home, it would have to be 45 decibels or less. So if they were just to blindly follow a model in a case where, it was all coming across the water, and they used the 0.5 as opposed to the 0, so basically saying, it's kind of muffled a bit by trees and other things where it wouldn't be. And then we went to that home, and it was 46, 47. If it was out of compliance, that's a problem. So the models tend to do a very good job if you've got the right people putting the inputs, understanding the topography, understanding the terrain. But ultimately, to protect people, that's why I really do think it's a good thing that the board, the department is recommending to the board
a procedure for ensuring post-construction monitoring. So that whatever the model tells you, ultimately the project has to be in compliance.
Well, that's if you have a belief that the developer won't just dial them back during the post-construction monitoring.
Well, and so before Pine, because I know he's going to want to jump in, but this, like, I'll tell you from a non-acoustical guy side, and the guy's saying here saying if it's under 45, then I'm good with that. That's why they have to be transparent on, and I would encourage the transparency on these reports, on these post-construction monitoring, that they have to show that they're at their maximum power output, and that goes along with the report. So if I look at a post-construction monitoring report, not being the acoustical person, the first thing that I'd look for is, was it conducted under conditions where it was maximum power output? Where the confusion comes in sometimes, or where the challenge comes in sometimes, is that you'll have people who are testing not for compliance, not for sending things into the state for compliance, but they're testing maybe around their own home, or they're testing because they want to know what the levels are, and they're not working with the developer. The developer chooses not to work with them because it's not a state requirement. That's where you get this notion of, well, did they just curtail them during that time? That can't be the case under what the department is proposing to the board. I apologize, I'm going to mess this up all day long, but the department is proposing to the board, it's my understanding, is that they would have to provide that data saying it's at maximum. And if it's not, then
Can't use the data.
can't use the data.
Did Annette raise her hand, I thought? Yes, go ahead, Annette Smith.
Annette Smith from Orange for Clean Environment. Question for Dr. Olson.
Could you stand up, please?
The health canvas study, why were the elderly and children and vulnerable populations who have abandoned their homes not included in the study?
So the elderly were included, the children were not. And the reason why, my understanding, and I'm not going to, I'll just tell you what my understanding of what happened with the children not being included, is there's special ethics approval that's required. It would require a much more in-depth and detailed study, and it was certainly asked for or recommended, myself included. I'm on public comment during the development side, asking them to consider the children's side. It was, the considerations around it, I believe, are that if they're able to deal with, and this is often a case in the environmental health world, that if they're not seeing the effect in the adult population, then certainly for the noise, then it would be fine. The elderly were included, it just there was an age range of how old people were living up to. So I would have to go back in, and I could go back in to find that. I just don't have the number off the top of my head. In terms of the abandoned home side, there's a lot of misnomer around the abandoned home side of what's happened within that study. And again, if the board wishes, I can go back into the study in more detail and come back up. But they reported all of the homes that were, and it's not abandoned, it's they call them vacant homes. Okay, so in any area that you go, there will be a certain number of homes that have been left vacant or have been left and are not utilized. And what Health Canada saw, and they show in their papers, is that the rate of vacant homes close to turbines and out to 10 kilometers away, there was no distance. So they had reported that they don't believe that there was any change in the vacated home ratio. Were there individuals within those project areas that may have left their homes? It's possible, and no, Health Canada did not study those.
So, in follow-up, I just wanted to ask you, as
Could
a
you stand up,
doctor,
Please, it's hard to hear you when you sing.
sorry, as a doctor, what are the health effects of infrasound, and what are the health effects of sleep deprivation?
Okay, so just to be very clear, I have a PhD in environmental health. I'm not a physician, but I can forget my question. Well, I can answer your question. I mean, the effects of infrasound are, until you get above the hearing threshold of infrasound, which is typically in around the 95 to 100, give or take, dBg. So you have to be well above where we are now. There are some studies that have looked at a variety of conditions where you get nausea, headaches, issues around those type of issues. But it has to be, the studies that have been done on that show that it has to be above that audibility threshold. So these are,
what the effects are.
so I just, nausea, headaches, most of that is the type of issue around there. We don't, you have to really go out of your way to subject somebody to to that type of level of infrasound. This is not something we deal with on a common occurrence. So the laboratory studies, these are not long-term prolonged studies. There's the NASA studies, yeah, but I mean, so really, infrasound is not typically a concern because it's at levels that we, right here in the room today, lower. So, no, because the reality there again is that we're not seeing infrasound linked to the sleep side because people are not typically exposed to levels which would be high enough to induce that. Certainly if you were at a level of audibility of infrasound, you would not be able to sleep.
I meant what are the health effects of sleep?
Oh, sorry, there's a myriad of health effects of sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation is a very, something we need to protect against. What you will see in the report that I prepared is that sleep deprivation or lack of quality sleep is actually one of the primary challenges faced in North America for the general population. Right here in this room, 50% of you do not, at least 50% of you do not get quality long-term health and sleep. It leads to cardiovascular disease, it leads to stress, it leads to a whole myriad of issues. Sleep deprivation has been linked to cancer, shift work, so that's why it is important and critical when you're setting an environmental sound level to ensure the protection of sleep.
Thank you.
Yes.
Just a clarification, Mr. Ashtiani. There was one graph that one plot of, that you put up, and it showed background noise in, I think, red, and it had the wind turbine generated noise, and they seem to converge at the higher wind speed.
Yep.
But it appeared that there was a direct relationship between the noise generated by wind turbines and wind speed, and a one-to-one relationship, therefore, between the noise generated by wind turbines and power output. Am I correct in reading that?
So the part that you have to be careful about, this is wind speed at the microphone location, and that's different than wind speed at the hub of the turbine where the sound's being generated. The turbine itself as a machine outputs its sound in relation to wind speed, in that when it's not windy and it's not turning, it doesn't make it sound, and as it starts turning and ramping up, it starts to ramp up to its rated power. Once it hits its rated power, the sound basically gets limited by that power. So if the wind speed continues to increase but the power doesn't, what we find in testing close to the turbines is that the sound power basically hits that rated power and stays there as long as it's making that power.
So to be clear, the faster the wind turbine spins at where the wind turbine is located, the more sound is generated from that turbine. It's a direct one-to-one relationship, yes?
The faster
or
the
nearly?
blades spin, not direct one-to-one, but generally.
Close
speaking,
to.
Yeah. Close
Okay,
to.
so
the
if I were to represent to you that a wind turbine reaches its maximum noise level short of its maximum power rating, would that be inaccurate?
Just short of, sure, 95%, something like
At 95%, but halfway toward its power rating, it would not reach its maximum noise output, correct?
It depends on the turbine. You have to look at the actual sound power versus what's called the power curve. Some of them will reach it close to half. Some of them reach it very close to maximum. And so it really depends on the individual manufacturer.
So the ones that reach it close to half, if they run at a higher level of power output, the noise would not be increased beyond that maximum?
Yeah, again, you have to look at the specification for that individual turbine. I've seen ones where right around 50 to 60% power, they're within a decibel of their maximum. So, I mean, for all intents and purposes, 1 decibel is the same as maximum. I've seen other ones where if you're looking at older stall control turbines, they actually keep going up and increasing as the hub height wind speed increases. So even at 85% power, they're not close to their maximum
So
sound
it's
power.
turbine design dependent?
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
thank you.
But that's also accounted for in the modeling, right?
Yeah, that's right. When you go in the model, you decide what sound output you assign to that source. So presumably in those models, you look at the operation of the turbine and you look at the maximum, that's what you put in the model.
Thank you.
Yes.
Christine Lang.
Can you stand up, please?
I have a question about the interior standard. So, well, actually, two questions. One, the 45 decibel standard that the department is recommending is at the home, so not at the property line.
That's correct. It's at the exterior of the home is what I understand.
So right now, Vermont standard is 30 dBAs inside the home. So if it's 45 dBAs at the home and the windows are open, when your windows are open, you're not going down 15 dBAs. If you're standing there and your sound just outside your window is 45 dBAs. So basically we're getting a standard where it's louder in the house. And what is do you know, does your standard change as far as what's a valid, what would be a protective standard in the home for people sleeping?
So I'll start there at the last part. There's a notion out there, or not a notion, there is, for example, the World Health Organization, other organizations have said it would be great if you could have 30 decibels or less inside your home on average over the course of the year. So it's not on a night-by-night basis, but over the course of the average of the year in order to really ensure good night's sleep. There are others that will tell you that standard should be 40. There are other agencies that say 40 decibels because that would be the equivalent to a very quiet room. And most people's homes, you may not ever achieve 30, windows closed, everything else, no wind and the like. For example, if I just stop talking for a second here, that hum of the HVAC system, the hum of the projector even right there, we're somewhere, what's that?
More than 30.
Oh, well, yeah, we're over 40. We're probably in the, 45 to 50 right now, just with that sort of background. So in terms of, you're right, you may not, it depends on the type of home and everything else. The reason why I don't advocate for an interior standard is that it's not enforceable. There's so many other complications to that, and nobody tends to, Vermont was the first that I'm aware of that went to that number, and in some cases. And so by protecting the exterior, what you look at is that when you look at highway traffic regulations, if you look at other sound standards, they're all regulated outside in order to ensure protection for inside. So that 45 number will be somewhere between around 10 decibels less. If you had the windows open, there's some stuff in the report that I prepared, that shows that from the Department of Transportation here in the U.S. has done a lot of work on different home types, different distances and like the WHO. So people will tell you between 10 and 20 decibels. So, the interior number, depending on the day, would likely be 30 to 35, windows open. The other thing, though, I want to caution is that we're not talking about setting a sound standard where you're going to have 45 decibels blanketing a community. That 45 decibels would be the maximum sort of worst-case scenario with conservative modeling at the closest homes. We're not talking about having all of Vermont blanketed with that. We are trying to protect then for the individual homes. And because not everybody's going to live that close. Most people in projects you'll see, sound modeling done, there'll be a handful of homes at 45 decibels, the rest will be 40, 35, and far less. So we are looking at the individual homes in this case.
Yes, in the back.
Sorry, the one thing I wanted to add is the Health Canada study would have had that taken into account as well. So the levels that they used are outdoor levels, and so all of the health outcomes would have been related.
That's right. Yes, right. And all the other studies too. There are some sound studies that are done exterior, interior homes to show that for wind turbines. Very few of the health ones actually have those exterior, interior, and health correlations. But where we do see that again is that the exterior levels are then accounted for with people having their windows open. They weren't told to keep their windows shut or anything like that. It was over the course of a couple of years.
Yes, in the back here. Yeah.
My name is Ebony Capital. I want to talk some more about the exterior noise. You're talking about, and the department is only talking about at the home, right outside the home, is that correct?
That's correct. It would be a measurement at the exterior of the home.
So you're aware that in Vermont, it's very rural, and a lot of people in Vermont live in the country and have properties. They have farms, they have gardens, they have animals, they have forests, so they spend time outside. Now, in Act 250, which is Vermont's statewide land use law, there's
they've had a lot of experience with noise, mostly from gravel pits or quarries. There's a standard at the home, but there's also a standard at the property line. And I'm very interested to know why the department has ignored the issue of people being outside in their properties, whether in terms of health effects. The property line could be very close to the wind turbines that are spinning all day long while you're outside working in your own property. The DBAs could be much higher than, presumably they could be higher than 45. And I'm very interested to know basically what the department is doing. It's saying, well, too bad. You either suffer health effects, extreme annoyance, or you don't use your property. And I would like to know what the justification for that is.
I'm going to let the department speak directly to your question, but in terms of, what you raise is a very good issue, and so what we see in the literature and we see in the studies, and we ask those questions. We don't just ask what the exterior level is at a home and whether that's going to be okay for sleep. I'm oversimplifying that here. In the report, in the literature that I prepared for to be sent to the board, there's a discussion of that daytime standard. Is there, how do we set daytime standards versus nighttime standards? What you'll see as you're describing on things like quarries and pits and other very loud sound sources, and that aren't necessarily constant, that daytime standards tend to be much higher. Daytime standards tend to be 50, 55 decibels, 60, depending on the jurisdiction. And so I'm saying that those type of standards tend to be property line, but they tend to be much, much higher. And that's to account for what you say. When we look at the studies, there's also a set of what we call it the quality of life studies that have been done around the wind turbines. There's no question there is this level of annoyance that's reported. And so the question then becomes is that beyond a tolerable level? Is it going to impair you from using your property? Is it going to be something that you're not going to then be able to do? I don't want to leave you with the impression that I'm saying as long as you can get a good night's sleep, I don't care what happens to you on your property. That's not it. So what we see is, again, the Health Canada data and the work of others looks at both the daytime and a lot of breakdown into the daytime as you get into the detailed issues, and we don't see that. What we do see and what we have to be careful about is annoyance levels and, as you say, the quality of life side. And what we see for the quality of life studies, the larger ones that have been done, that I'm not telling you that if you had 45 decibels at the exterior of your home, that you'd never hear it on your property. That's not going to be the case. There will be times that you will certainly, if you happen to be that person. That's where that it becomes a matter for the board. Also, you have higher daytime levels of just being on your property. To put that 45 in perspective again, this room, if I'm not talking, is about 45 decibels. So it's meant to be within a level in rural side, as you said, you've got animals, you've got rural things going on, and it's not to then disturb it to the point where you can't enjoy your property, the home. But it would be the department that would have to answer as to why they chose not to do that.
May I? Thank you.
Certainly.
Thanks, Chris. Again, Chris Recchia. We did look at that, and I come from an environmental standards background where that is the case, where you're measuring at the property line, and you are measuring, let's say, air emissions from a source. You model it to the property line, and it has to be in compliance at the property line. So we get that, but I think Dr. Olson said this very well and explained the difference really well. So that is the rationale, that we did not need to do that outside of where people are enjoying their property, mostly during the day, but certainly the health impacts are protected at 45. And the background, as you can see, gets up in the 50s, 60s, and I'm on a development review board. Gravel pit has had an 85 dBA requirement for trucks going in and out of the property, and noise, and that was at the property boundary for those neighbors. So it's why the annoyance stuff, I believe, needs to be addressed by easements, by negotiations, by buyouts, or by, as I say, direct benefits, because this is anecdotal, but You know, I have a greenhouse at my farm. It's got a fan that runs 24/7 to keep the layers of plastic burn. And I was out there one beautiful quiet night and I heard it and I was like, geez, if I didn't know what that was doing, that would really annoy me. But because it's mine, it didn't annoy me. I think that that is an issue too, to go into this annoyance factor. I'm going to stop there because I think Dr. Olson actually explained it very well.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Follow up, go ahead.
Yeah, just, you're talking, I don't understand. Am I mistaken that the closer you get to a noise source, the louder it would be? I mean, you keep talking about the 45 decibel is protective if you're outside, but we're talking about, you're saying 45 is protective at the house. We're talking about away from the house, closer to the turbine. I'm assuming it's going to be louder, number one. And number two, Commissioner Recchia, your situation, you have a fan. I don't have a fan. I live out in the boonies in Calais. It's extremely quiet during the day. So your situation is one, my situation's another. Every Vermonter's situation is different.
Right.
But one thing that's true, I think, is that there's a lot of quiet areas in Vermont. There's a lot of people who use their properties outside. And I thought that the closer you got to a noise source, the louder it would be.
So ma'am, I'll try to take a crack. Again, the 45 decibels at the exterior of the home is just that's that threshold number to make sure of protection of the sleep and all those other things. But the studies go beyond that. And what we look at is that, you know, again, you just described that you live in Vermont. There's a lot of rural area here. People enjoy the outdoors. I'm very well aware of that in Vermont. Okay, but also think about where these wind turbines are. You know, these 150,000 turbines around the world, the tens of thousands here in the U.S. They are located primarily in rural areas.
That's right.
Some of them are in flat. You know, some of them are very flat. Some of them are ridge lines, just like here in Vermont. I mean, so it is the studies that have been done. And as I said, look at both daytime as well as nighttime. Look at people, and they don't restrict people from using their property. So it is the experience of people as a whole, as they're using their properties, that goes into the notion of the health studies. You are right that the closer you get to a wind turbine, the louder it is. I mean, noise is different, and noise is different and unique for every person. So you stand under the base of the turbine, if it's operating in full power mode and everything's going, you will, and if you haven't, go stand there, you will have that wish. You can still carry on a normal conversation, you know, being at the base, so you're somewhere in the neighborhood of 65, 75, somewhere in there, 65-ish decibels while you're standing under there, okay? As you move away, it certainly, you know, it decreases, it's one of those things where we're looking to ensure protection of everybody, and what I'm saying is that we haven't seen overall the quality of life deteriorate, people reporting that, but that's where I absolutely encourage, and as the commissioner said, projects go better in communities where you have buy-in, where you have cooperation, and you have an understanding of what the project's going to be and benefiting a larger group. So we certainly know that annoyance with turbines decreases with the more cooperation.
So in effect, you're saying that if you have an...
Sir?
Oh,
I'm sorry, I didn't call on you. And you've already had a chance to speak. I'm trying to get to people who haven't had a chance yet. Yeah, with the hat on there, sir.
My name's Luke DeLond, Swanton.
What's your last name?
DeLond. You're talking about 45 dBA, and you're saying the way you're talking is basically saying there should be a distance of safety and health. So basically it should be like a mile, 2 miles, whatever it is, or even half a mile from homes. And the more you talk, is more you're saying it should be further away from people's homes for their safety, for their health. And you just said cooperation. Well, we want to cooperate, but when it's affecting our home, our life, our health, our value of our property, our investment, and when these developers just throw them up wherever they feel like doing it, is not right. And it shouldn't be done.
So I'll deal with the health and the setback side, the rest obviously is beyond
Right.
beyond my scope. I certainly appreciate your comments and not trying to, I just can't be the guy answering. No, it doesn't need to be a mile or 2 miles back, and where I'm saying it, so let me try to be clear. The 45, again, the sound level is what triggers the health issue. So you, and you could have people, you'll hear people say, oh, these turbines are getting taller, and they are. And they'll say, well, they're getting louder. And so is the setback distance from a taller and something that's outputting more sound appropriate, or is it that having to make sure that regardless of how tall, regardless of even the shorter, some of the smaller ones are actually a heck of a lot louder, believe it or not.
Right,
So,
'cause they're closer to the ground.
and regardless of the height and the sound power output, what I'm saying is the sound at somebody's home is what's important. In terms of a distance setback for that, it really varies depending on the layout of your project as to what distance you need to be back to get to 45 decibels. In my experience, having reviewed a lot of modeling reports, and maybe I call on Pym to discuss as well, you're at least 2,000 feet, if not even further back, to reach that 45 decibels.
Depending on the layout.
Depending on the layout, and that's what I'm saying.
So when you're
and
saying
number of turbines.
at least 2,000 feet, what you're comparing it to, how many turbines? 1, 7?
These are projects that vary from, a couple of turbines up to hundreds.
So
And
for the safety, both ways, there should be a minimum of so many feet away from a home, or the 45 dBA, whichever is greater.
And if the board was wanted to consider that, what I would encourage the board to do is to have some of that study done to say, what would 45 decibels look like in order to get there? There are jurisdictions where they've set both, and typically the distance is set on we believe that you'll need to be at least this far back to get to that sound level. So that's why I say that as long as you've got the sound level, the distance is secondary.
The one thing I should add is that, if someone comes up with a really, really quiet turbine and they want to sell it because now they can put a turbine and the sound level at somebody's house would be much quieter, even if it was closer, that does inhibit that kind of development. So at some point, it's like, why make a quieter turbine? You can't put more of them because they weren't allowed anyway, even though the sound level would be less. So that's the difficulty in saying it has to be this distance, because if you're trying to control the noise level, just set the noise level. And the distance should depend on how loud the turbines are.
So with you guys working with the companies, the developers, if you say this project is not a good project, not a good place to put them, do you tell them that, or do you do whatever you can to make sure that that project goes in?
Well, I'll start with from my half. There are limits that I have that I won't go beyond. There are setbacks and types of projects that if I look at a layout, if I look at a design, if they're too close, I don't support a project that's going to be 1,000 feet from somebody's home. It doesn't happen. So if a developer comes to me and says, here's a project, here's a layout, here's what the state, I'll give you another example. There are counties where the sound limit is 60 decibels. I will not work for a developer who in that county, although they may be perfectly legitimately able to do so, and I'm not saying that people who lived up to 60 are being harmed. There's just science isn't there to support that at this point, and so I won't work in a county where you have that. So yes, I absolutely, if I look at a layout, if I look at working with developers, when I start talking to developers, if I'm going to go the larger companies that say have multiple projects, they're calling on and asking for the advice because they're going to be in these communities for a long period of time, and the responsible developers want to make sure that they know what the science is, especially as it's been rapidly evolving over the last couple of years.
So I'll add my section. So most of the time when we get hired by developers, it's to do a noise model. And so they give us a layout and we say, here's the predictions. You're going to be over on these receptors, so you better do something about it. You can either put quieter turbines there or move those around or whatever, but I can't change science, because if I just change the number and it goes to a review, the reviewer says, how come these numbers don't jive? So it's pretty cut and dry in that and all the information's there. Here's the model, here's the inputs, here's the levels, and you can go. It pretty well gets checked by regulatory anyway.
Mr. Lewis? over here on this side.
Thank you, Chair. Sosh Lewis from Dunhill Saunders. Dr. Olson, I think you and Mr. Ashtiani mentioned earlier that the sound power at the base of a wind turbine is typically on the order of 65 dBA. I wonder if you're aware that the sound limit under Act 250 at the property line in daytime is typically 70 dBA in Vermont.
I can't speak to that. I'm not aware what it is. I mean, it is what it is. Again, I don't believe that you need to set a property line limit. I think property lines, what you have to be careful about property lines are things like tower fall down distances, things like that that are covered separately. But from a sound perspective, from wind sources, I don't know that it needs to be covered.
The only thing I'd add is I think you mean sound pressure level. You said sound power, and that's the E, and not the what someone would experience if they're standing. That's sound pressure level.
I'll defer.
Les Blomberg,
Yeah, Les Blomberg.
please stand up.
I got a question that was a follow-up to the commissioner who left, but I'm hoping that you can still help us. One is, what are the mechanisms that the department's proposing to get those easements and agreements that will address the issues that the sound measurements that these guys are talking about are not going to address? And I have one follow-up after that.
Sure. So very briefly, in the proposed rule that the department has put forward to the board, the last section of the proposed rule outlines waiver provisions that allows for waiver of the sound limits if the developer is able to obtain a sound easement, a waiver, a buyout agreement with a homeowner or a landowner, or any similar mechanism. But we wanted to allow for flexibility, provided that it created a level of certainty and comfort for the homeowner, the landowner.
And I would note that doesn't solve the question, because that solves the problem of it being in violation of it being over 45. But that does not solve the question, which the doctor pointed out, is that his health limit here can't address those other issues. The department told us that they were going to address them through easements and such, but there's no mechanism to cause that.
Maybe if I can, to clarify, at least from my perspective, that easement isn't to say that you can have up to 45 decibels. That is if there are projects and developers where, let's say I come into the community and I say, okay, here's my layout. They give it to Mr. Ashtiani, and they say, this is what we want. This is what we need for our project, for the wind regime, for everything else. And then Mr. Ashtiani comes back and says, as he was describing earlier, project area is great, you're covered, you're going to be less than 45 decibels everywhere, except for these two homes. And then the question is, in order to be over 45 decibels, they would have to work with those landowners through the various mechanisms described by the department. The reason I'm comfortable of saying that that's okay, and you can actually have over 45 decibels, everything I've been describing to you now is the sort of the non-participating, we call them non-participating, right? The folks that, aren't financially benefiting, may or may not want the project, doesn't matter if they want the project, they're not participating financially within the project. We know that from the research and the studies, you can actually have quite a bit higher. That's why earlier I was asked, what would a maximum standard be? 50 is a fine number, and the reason why is because we see that participating landowners, the annoyance reported is 0, no matter how loud it gets, right? Because, and it's similar to what the commissioner was describing, it's his fan. He actually is benefiting from it. So that's why we make those distinctions. And so from a health perspective, that's why I'm okay with the department proposing easements or the like.
But that wasn't my question.
Then sorry, yeah, I just want to clarify though as to why from the health side. Sorry, I didn't
then either. Yeah.
Okay, well, the difference was, the commissioner had said that to address annoyance, he said that we were going to address health here, but to address the annoyance issues with the turbines, he would resort to other instruments and other tools, such as, agreements. And this would be, annoyance was going to occur below a health impact level. But he said that, but he did not tell us what tools would force that. The reason I say this is because one really good tool to do that is a setback. A setback creates the incentive. Now the industry has to go out and get those agreements, okay? Where I didn't know if they had some other tool or instrument to make that happen, but it appears that they don't, that there is nothing in the plan that will address the annoyance issue.
Okay, thanks. You right there?
Shauna Ratner from Fairfield. I'd like to speak again go back again to the post-compliance monitoring. It's my understanding that what you're recommending and what the department is recommending is continuous monitoring on a minute-by-minute basis, where you then take the average of the most egregious numbers, so the places where you're most likely to get a violation. My question is, what's the recommendation for the, is that correct? Am I right so far, basically?
I'll let you finish your question, then.
Okay. My question is, over what period of time does that average come into effect, and then what constitutes either compliance or non-compliance? Because, and I'm asking, because if the purpose of this rule, as I would understand it, is to protect those who are nearest to the turbine from adverse impact, it's not going to do any good if that sound violation is allowed to continue for too long a period of time.
Okay, so there's two parts to that question. The first one is how long the monitoring should occur over. And in my opinion, it should occur over the right amount of time such that you'll get sufficient amount of data to make that conclusion. So if it takes you a week, 2 weeks to get that condition, then that's how long it takes. If it starts taking really long and those conditions don't occur, and I don't mean that you take measurements over 2 weeks and you just take the highest numbers. I mean, you take measurements over 2 weeks and you look for a sufficient number of valid samples. And valid samples, again, being that the wind direction is appropriate, the sound output of the turbines is appropriate, and you've got the same for the ambient. Once you have a sufficient number of data points that you can make a conclusion off of, you can then make the conclusion. If you haven't got the information, like if the conditions haven't occurred, there's two things that you can conclude from that. Is that one, either the worst case condition that you modeled for doesn't happen that often anyway, so maybe you should look at some other condition, or that that there's a certain amount of time after which you can say we'll just take the data that's there and evaluate, you know, what has occurred over that time. So you basically, you need to be able to make a conclusion, and if you can't make a conclusion because the data is not there, then that should be proof enough that the worst case condition doesn't actually occur and it's not as bad as the model had originally predicted. I don't know if does that actually answer your question?
No, not really. First of all, just to clarify, are we talking about continuous post-construction monitoring, or are we only talking about occasional post-construction monitoring?
So I would say that once the site's been commissioned, you would say, for example, that the sound level contribution at, you know, let's say 3 locations from this site have to be measured and evaluated as a condition of the approval. Once that commissioning occurs, you can do that at these 3 locations, and again, it could take 2 weeks, it could take 3 months, but once that's done, it's done, and you've assessed the actual.
The reason it could take so long is because you're waiting for the right conditions to occur. Exactly. In terms of the wind speeds and wind direction. Exactly. In order to capture what you're concerned about. That's right. And then how does the 1 minute interval work into that?
So what happens is you're taking 1 minute intervals continuously during that time. So when you're doing your campaign, you're always taking those 1 minute samples, right. And you're looking at which ones are valid, and you're looking for valid 1 minute intervals. And if you have, we've suggested a minimum of 20 for both the on and the off condition for a given wind speed. So once you have that, you say, okay, now I've got a sufficient sample with the turbines on and a sufficient sample with them off, and then you can make that evaluation. So during the measurements, they are continuous, but during the analysis, you're looking at whether or not you have sufficient data.
All right, so just to follow up, first of all, there are several problems, it seems to me, with that plan. One is it doesn't take into account the change in the seasons, which are very severe here in Vermont. We have real differences in our seasons. It doesn't take into account the degrading of the equipment over time. So what might be true in year 1 post-construction may not be true in year 5 post-construction, or year 10, or God forbid, year 20 post-construction. It doesn't allow for the kinds of monitoring you were talking about of blades degrading or icing conditions or other mechanical things that may or may not occur during that limited period that you're talking about setting a baseline. So that's a real issue. But the second issue, and the purpose of my first question that also you didn't respond to, is how many, even assuming, right, that you had data points, a number of valid data points that you could then average and say, okay, this is or is not compliance. How many data points would be required to show compliance or non-compliance? Has the department suggested that to the board, and is there any parameter around that, or are we simply opening up a situation where the developer can come back and say, I'm sorry, that's not enough data points. We can't make a judgment on that, even though all the data points would suggest non-compliance, but there really aren't enough of them.
Right, okay, so the first one, and I agree with you, I mean, no one got a dishwasher that got quieter over time, right? So there has to be some consideration that at some regular intervals, you would do post-construction monitoring again, if the department so chooses. I'm not opposed to that. The two conditions that we suggested this for is one, right after commissioning to prove the sound level limits right at the beginning of operation as part of the permit, and also in response to a noise complaint. So, I mean, if the board so wishes, they could easily put in a certain interval after which post-construction measurements would have to be repeated. In Quebec, they actually do have that. They have 1, 5, and 10. I would suggest that making it annual is a bit overkill, but I mean, that's up to you guys. To the other part of your question about having sufficient number of data points. So that is a really fine balance, because you want to have enough certainty, but you don't want to make something that never occurs so that the developer can say, we're still monitoring, we don't have the data, and it just kind of in perpetuity stays that way. So the 20 data points that we've had as a requirement is actually, I think, a pretty low bar to hit before you can say you have enough. To give you an example, the same or a very similar methodology is employed in Ontario, where you need 120 data points with the turbines operating for 4, 5, 6, and 7 meters a second, and you need 60 data points with the turbines off for 4, 5, 6, and 7 meters a second. Have the 20, I think it should be reasonable, and if that doesn't occur, then that's a real argument for the worst case conditions actually not occurring all that often.
So when you say operating, you mean without curtailment, right?
Operating without curtailment.
I didn't hear that, so.
Sorry.
Jim was saying, excuse me, right
Yeah,
here.
go ahead, ask that one
Okay,
question.
it was just a clarification, because you keep talking about operating without interference, without curtailment, because you could have maximum wind speed and not have maximum power output and thus noise output.
That's right.
So we're talking unabated.
Operating at close to maximum power, close enough such that the sound output is close to the maximum sound output. Okay. That's what we've suggested.
Maybe a brief follow-up to this. I mean, in terms of your question about, will things change over time? Usually that's where, project's up, if it's in compliance, if there are no issues, then it operates fine. If there is an issue, that's why we were encouraging this complaint process-driven side of things. So that, if there is a complaint, let's say at year 5 or year 6, I mean, there are projects where it happens, where the gearbox goes. Something happens with the turbine blade. And often, that is a problem, and it's also a problem for the machines. They want to fix it, but I don't want to suggest that there's never been a valid complaint. There certainly have, and those are the things that need to be fixed. So I think by incorporating that complaint-driven process as well, and you need to be careful on the abuse of a complaint-driven process, but that helps to deal with that, because over the time, as you go. The other one too, maybe to your questions, I don't think that it should be an open-ended. The developer gets their permit, they construct the project, and they say that they're monitoring in perpetuity. I don't know if there's a time frame that's been set by the board that says recommended by the department to the board that says, within 3 months or 6 months or a year, you need to demonstrate this. But, certainly something that if it's not contemplated yet, either could be contemplated by the board or could be put in as part of a condition of a permit, so that you don't just have a 12-year period of monitoring to say that you're not.
Okay, sorry, I have to interrupt. We've been going for 2 hours. The court reporter needs a break, so we're going to take a 10-minute break right now. We can continue this discussion right after we get back. To present, and then we have to be out of this room by 4:30. That's how much time we booked it for. And I think they may have another event
that they have to prepare for, so we're going to have to be out of here at 4:30. But if there's time after the other presenters go, we can return to the department's witnesses, the department's presenters at the end, if you'd like to do that. So we have some questions for you, which we'd like
Sure,
to
just
ask you.
very quickly, Mr. Ashiani is on his way.
Okay.
He's not quite here yet, but if I may, I want to address one of the questions that you asked right before we were at the break. The rule that the department is proposing contains a provision that would require additional sound monitoring 5 years after the initial round of post-construction monitoring. So the department's rule does contemplate ongoing monitoring beyond the initial monitoring, because
But just at the 5-year point.
that's what we have right now. But we understand, we hear your concern, and this is something that I think the board should obviously consider. That it might be appropriate to have additional monitoring beyond that initial 5 years.
May I ask one more quick question? What does the department anticipate recommending in terms of a complaint procedure? So if there is a complaint.
Certainly. So what we have contained in the proposed rule right now is that any complaint protocol that would, any complaint procedure that would be in place would be consistent with a complaint protocol that was recently developed by our Consumer Affairs Division. That was recently completed this past year. After a lot of discussion internally at the department, we've decided that we thought it was best to allow for the specific complaint protocols to be developed on a case-by-case basis. Only because at this point we have a framework that's been codified and outlined in the department's internal procedures, and we want that to be consistent with that. But we want to make sure that we have a full understanding of what we're looking at on a case-by-case basis, and we want to be able to develop it. We weren't 100% comfortable with recommending a complete complaint protocol at this time, which is why we didn't do it.
So just to be clear, what I'm hearing then is that there is no standard for what constitutes noncompliance within the framework of a complaint protocol.
The proposed rule outlines procedures for determining what compliance is based on the post-construction monitoring. The overall tenor of the rule that we propose indicates that the model that we use that would then be tweaked based on the post-construction monitoring would be a basis for making determinations of how to proceed with a complaint protocol. But we haven't gotten to the point where we're able to offer a complete complaint protocol at this point.
I would just suggest, and I'll be quiet, that you have quite a gap then, because what you've got is post-construction monitoring for some period directly post-construction, possibly some additional monitoring 5 years in the future, no provision for interim monitoring, and no provision, as I hear it, for a specific monitoring in response to a complaint. So I really don't see how this can possibly work to the benefit of people who are living in the proximity of these developments.
Would you remind me of your name, please?
Shauna Ratner from Fairfield.
Okay, so we'd like to go back to, we have some questions for you.
Is this on?
Yep.
Turning to the actual rule that was proposed, section 5.705C.
Excuse me, could you state who you are, sir?
Yes, my name is Tom Nauer. I'm an analyst with the board. Section 5.705C requires that post-construction sound monitoring information be fed back into the pre-construction sound model, as I understand it. And I am looking for someone from the department. I'm not sure who the right person is to answer, but what's the utility of that feeding information back into the pre-construction model? How does that help the board determine compliance with a standard?
So the situation where I could see that being helpful is, for example, if there's future projects that are going to be modeled and there's a different level of safety factor that could be used based on the results, you could help refine the modeling. The other thing you could do is look at situations where if there's a problem with a specific turbine and it's making more noise than it's supposed to, you know, what would go back into that model to see if the model had the correct amount of safety factor included, or if something needs to be adjusted.
Is there a standard, a sound monitoring standard that allows for monitoring at low temperatures without exceeding the tolerance of the testing equipment?
So that it's not a standard question, but an equipment reliability question. And I would say over the course of the last 10 years, I've seen equipment become more and more robust. And the minimum operating temperatures used to be around the freezing mark, then they were around -10, and what I'm seeing right now is instrumentation that frequently goes to -40 Celsius. Sorry, all these are Celsius.
I was just going to jump in there and remind you that you're in Vermont.
Yes. But I mean, at some point, it's
It
the
doesn't
same,
matter.
right? Yeah. So it is improving, but it is a limitation of the specific piece of equipment. So it's important that only data be used when it's in the valid operating range of the equipment. There's two. There's one is temperature, and the other one is humidity. I've also seen microphones be less and less, I don't know, so maybe more and more able to deal with high humidity situations, where before microphones would be good to something like 85% relative humidity. Microphones these days go all the way to 95 and sometimes 100%.
So understanding that this is an equipment-specific question, what happens if there's data from a monitoring period where it's indicated that it was below the manufacturer's specification for temperature? Is there a recognized adjustment, or do you throw out that data?
Yeah, the recommendation would be to throw it out. If the instrument is not capable of giving a reliable measurement for a given temperature, then relying on it is problematic. I mean, I suppose you could look at the tolerance that it needs to meet to be deemed reliable enough, and just simply add that number as a conservative measure. So if you can say, for example, that it's not within 2 decibels accuracy, then you can say that if it's more than 2 decibels below, there's a chance that it's all right. You won't really know for certain if the equipment's out of its operating range.
Thank you. Having reviewed all the filings from all the participants here, there didn't seem to be universal agreement about the height of the microphone. I've seen 1 meter, I've seen 1.5 meters, different proposals. So what is the 1 meter or 1.5 meters supposed to represent? What are we trying to analyze there?
Our recommendation is usually to put it where the window of the bedroom would be. So if it's a 2-story house, we'd actually recommend 4.5 meters. But the different heights are, and the slight variation you'll see, usually are relating to getting the microphone low enough near the ground where it's not as windy and you have less pseudo-noise contamination on the microphone. But most of the examples I've seen with monitoring that's happened in Vermont has been on only a single stage microphone screen. And what we advocate for is a secondary wind shield. So you have a 2-stage protection from wind-induced pseudo-noise. In that situation, it becomes less about how close to the ground you can get to limit the contamination, and more about, you know, where are you most interested in the sound level being evaluated.
Okay, and does the difference of 1 meter to 1.5 meters in height change dramatically the monitoring results if we're, 1,000 or 2,000 feet away from the source?
No, the only thing it will change again is the ambient noise. If you're in a situation where you will get less wind going over the microphone at the lower wind speeds, the actual sound difference is 0.5 meter difference is negligible.
Okay, and is there someone, either Mr. Kazicki or one of the consultants, that could just walk us through section 5.707 in its entirety? I have several questions, and it may be quicker for you to run the whole room through it.
Can we borrow?
This has to do with the analysis of the data from the post-construction monitoring.
So, is it starting page 6 of 8?
Correct.
Okay, so let me just get it. So starting with section A, named data organization and filtering. So the data has to be categorized into on and turbine on and ambient, or completely excluded. For the turbine on portion of the data, there has to be first, so that's now 5.707A1A. All the turbines need to be operating at least 10% of rated power, meaning that they have to be physically operating and they're physically generating some power. The closest, and then now part B says the closest turbine needs to be generating at least 80% of its rated power. This is so that it's operating close to the maximum noise. And alternatively, you can change that from an 80 to some other threshold if you can show from testing according to that IEC standard. That's the test report that identifies the sound power by electrical power. If you can show that the point at which you hit 3 decibels from the maximum, so let's say that ends up being 90% for one turbine, 50% for another, you can make that alternatively be the level at which the closest turbine needs to be operating for the data to be included. And the monitoring location has to not be within 45 degrees of an upwind direction, meaning that if you take a line as the crow flies between the turbine and the house, and then you give it plus or minus 45 degrees in the upwind direction, everything outside of the wind from that can be included in the analysis. So if the wind is, let's say the turbine is located directly north and the house is directly south, you would exclude any times when the wind is blowing from the house to the turbine plus or minus 45 degrees.
And why is that?
The main reason is that sound propagation changes when you go from downwind to upwind. Downwind propagation of sound is more efficient than upwind. And so what we're finding is that if you want to, the purpose of this is to kind of look for something that is like a worst case condition, isolate that condition, and then see the variation of only within that condition. So if we start averaging times when the wind is actually upwind, the wind's going from the house to the turbine, it's going to result in a slightly lower sound level at the house. And so this measure is to not have any of those bringing the average down, if you will. So the other corollary is that you could only require downwind, so that you could only look at the times when the wind would be blowing from the turbine to the house, plus or minus 45. And that could be fine. The only thing we found practically is that the number of data points get less and less if you try to look at it for a narrower wind direction range. So that's why we basically said downwind and crosswind gets included in that bucket, but upwind does not.
I have two follow-ups based on what you just said. Rated power output, is that analogous to nameplate capacity of a turbine model?
Yeah.
Okay. And then I think I understood what you said. So if we have 360 degrees in a circle, what you're suggesting is that we would exclude data from 90 degrees upwind. You would include monitoring data that falls within the other 270 degrees.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so the next section is about ambient. And so ambient data shall be categorized as such that only all contributing turbines are either shut down or generating less than 1% of nameplate. Now, the reason it just says less than 1% is because sometimes the wind will be so low that there is a very minimal amount of generation, but it's not exactly zero, but it's pretty well zero in terms of sound emission. And you don't necessarily need to call the ISO to organize an outage for some of those conditions to occur. And so it's to be able to use those times when the facility is down anyway, and not specifically ordered to be shut down. Number 3 is about filtering, basically. 3A basically says data is to be categorized on or ambient. Periods between 10 minutes prior to and 1 hour after precipitation and monitoring oh, sorry, this is about exclusion. So you would exclude the data if you can't categorize it as on, meaning the generation was below that, let's say 80%, but above the 1%, so it's something in between. So then you exclude it because you can't count it for on or off. And you also exclude times when there's been rain between 10 minutes prior and 1 hour after the actual time that you're measuring. There's 2 reasons. One is to avoid times when it's actually raining and the sound level is contaminated by the rain. And the second is to help give that buffer if, for example, rain is occurring in the area and not exactly where you are. The ambient levels sometimes will still increase anyway, but you know, it's not something you can control for easily, so you know, you would exclude that data. Intervals contaminated by transient ambient sounds such as automobiles, barking dogs, etc., and periods when the wind speed is greater than 5 meters a second. So those are all times when you wouldn't use any of those intervals. So that's all part of 5.707 A3 A to D.
I'm going to interrupt you and cut you off. You've answered some of my questions, and so I'm not sure if it would be a good use of our time. Just to be clear, under 3D, this is wind speed at the receptor?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. The local wind speed.
And then on the next page, under C1D, logarithmically subtract the average sound level. Is that the right word, average, or was it supposed to be ambient sound level?
Yes, that's right.
It should have been ambient?
The ambient sound level from the average turbine on. Yes, it's supposed to be average ambient sound level. There's a word missing.
Okay.
So logarithmically subtract the average ambient sound level from the average turbine on sound level in each wind bin to derive the projectability sound level.
Okay, thank you. And understanding the department has not proposed a setback standard, and you have discussed how other jurisdictions sometimes apply setbacks, sometimes apply that in conjunction with the decibel standard. There are other people in the room who do support a setback standard. So I just had a question about that. Do turbines of the same capacity and the same height, but from different manufacturers, would they be expected to have the same sound power level?
Not necessarily.
Okay, and what would account for those differences?
So you have to look at the sound production mechanism. Basically, what manufacturers are always striving to do is to get a better designed blade that gets them more power at the same sound level, or less sound, or equal sound at a higher power level. And so what happens is they'll design an airfoil blade and they'll look at the noise generating mechanisms. There's trailing edge noise, which is the trailing part of the blade. There's leading edge noise. There's flow separation problems that happen. And as the research is been progressing, if you want to count it this way, the decibels per megawatt of power produced is on its trajectory down. So you could get the same turbine that has a more efficient blade that can operate maybe at a higher RPM, spin a bit faster, but because of its blade optimization, not make any more sound. So it can make more power, but not more sound. If you take the same turbine with the same control parameters, then it becomes a lot harder to spin it faster and not make more sound. But that again comes to software control algorithms and that kind of thing. And that's something manufacturers are always striving to kind of push their technology. So you could definitely have two turbines that are the same height, the same kind of dimensions, generating wildly different amounts of noise.
Maybe just a quick clarification from my end here. I'm not suggesting that the board not put a distance setback. What I'm suggesting is that if you're going to put a distance setback because you want to make sure the sound level is achieved, then don't put an overly restrictive setback that you know, I'm just going to give a wild example. The board decides that you want to put a 10-mile setback because you think that's going to achieve 45 decibels. It will achieve 45 decibels, but of course, it would be a lot closer than that, what you would do. So in the jurisdictions that typically account for both, they set the sound level, in my experience, they set the sound level that they desire, and then they look for approximately what distance, and it's usually on the shorter end of that distance, would you need to be set back to achieve that sound level. So it's just it's counterproductive to set, let's say, a 2-mile setback when you want a 45 decibel. If you want a 2-mile setback for other reasons, not because you want a 45 or a 40 or some other sound level, it's just taking that into account if you consider a distance setback. If you're doing it for a sound level, then there's some more nuances there, I guess.
Follow up to that. So that variation as to distance, assuming that you're starting at the sound point and then calculating to a distance decision, does that distance vary according to the topography and other factors, and therefore it's not one size fits all?
That's exactly. It actually varies for a whole bunch of reasons. One is, as Mr. Ashtiani is describing, is different turbine types have different sound power outputs, different topographies, different regions, and so that's why personally I like to see sound limits set that you're comfortable with, and the distance is then generated by that modeling and by the compliance. And we wrote a paper a couple of years ago where we looked at the effect of distance on the resulting sound level at homes with distance, and you get anywhere between a 5 decibel and a 10 decibel difference in scattered. So let's say you were at 2,500, let's say you're at a half mile. So you're at 2640 feet, you're at the half mile, the sound level could be 35 decibels or it could be 45 decibels. And so that's why I say setting a distance as a proxy for sound, you can combine them, but it really can vary so dramatically. And even in the state of Vermont here, where you've got such wide-ranging topography, where one size won't necessarily fit all. That was the caution.
And just finally for me, Mr. Ashtiani gave an answer that two turbines by different manufacturers with the same height and same nameplate capacity may have different sound power levels. Does that general answer hold true for all the different categories of turbines, whether they be very small to the largest?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah. I think one of the largest factors is RPM. So if one of them runs at a higher RPM than the other, I think independent of the size, then you can have a fairly big variation.
Yeah, it's such a note. I think she's still tonight. Yeah, you should. All right, I'll lean. I'll lean forward. Kevin Fink with the board. I wanted to ask you earlier, Mr. Olson, you had, I think I understood you to say earlier that your conclusion is that a 30 dBA inside level is not necessary to protect public health, that levels slightly above that may still be protective. Is that?
No, so the challenge with the 30 dBA, it's not a standard, it's not a hard and fast guideline, it's not something around the world where people say, okay, 30 decibels, above that we're going to have significant health effects or health effects at all. It's more of, think of it more of as a desired level. Okay, so when the World Health Organization, when others have proposed levels that would be nice to achieve in your bedroom, that as you can imagine, even for personal experience, if you're in your house and the kids have got the stereo blasting in the basement and you're trying to get to sleep and the level, it's really loud for them, but it's interrupting your sleep, or there's various ways. The quieter in your room, typically for most people, the better night's sleep one would achieve. So we would really like to see levels down around 30. The challenge with a lot of these desirable levels is that very rarely, or if ever, are they actually achieved. And so when you set an exterior sound level, those are the ones we want to achieve, so you're really not then interrupting the sleep. So when we look at when you come to noise-specific standards or noise-specific sources and then trying to understand those, that's where, for example, the Health Canada study, the Backer study, and others that I showed you, they're the important ones to know that from a wind turbine source itself, multiple projects, very different turbines across 2 provinces, the Backer one, similar type of a study, where we're actually seeing at 45. Backer study actually went up to 54 decibels, okay, because some of the older European models. But that we know that at 45 decibels or less, we're not actually getting that interruption of sleep, regardless of what the interior level is in those individual 1,200 homes. At a 46 decibel or less, we weren't seeing that interruption of sleep. So whether the interior sound level was 30, 35, 55, because somebody likes to sleep with stereo on, really didn't matter that the sound level from the turbine wasn't causing sleep disturbance.
Thank you, that's helpful. One of the things I'm trying to understand is some of the items referenced in your report and some of the attenuation, the outside to inside attenuation studies we've seen suggest that at 45 dBA exterior you would still have levels inside that would be higher than 30.
It would depend on the type of house. So what I put into the report, one of the documents I referred to was your Department of Transportation, U.S. Department of Transportation document. They update it every so often. It has actually quite a comprehensive section on looking at that. So when they're setting levels, they look at those attenuation factors. So certainly design of home, there's a much more detailed table in their document where design of home, the window age, windows open, windows shut. You can actually go from an attenuation. Typically, people will say the attenuation is 10 decibels with partially open windows in the summertime and the like, and that over the course of the year, if you shut those windows, you could be 20 or more. And the challenge with again, remembering that it's not we absolutely need the quietest night every night, that those guidelines are general, it would be nice, desirable to achieve. It's over the course of the year, over the course of a week, over the course of a longer period of time. So it's recognized with environmental noise and sound sources that you're not always going to strive for those. You have to find that balance between, if you want, in this case, energy production from wind turbines, if that's the desire or the goal of the state or the agency, then it's what level can you set to ensure the production of health. So it's not that you're never going to hear them. Typically, even with a sort of 45 decibel or less, even with windows open, in many cases you won't hear them in the interior of the bedroom, but that doesn't mean that it's always going to be the case.
Thanks. I also wanted to ask and I apologize, I'm terrible with names. So earlier, in response to some questions, you were discussing the number of 1-minute increments to use in conducting an analysis of whether the level was in excess of a requirement. And the way the rules framed it, I believe you've recommended a minimum of 20. And in part informed by some of that discussion we were having earlier, is there a need to include a maximum number, or is there a concern that, for example, in monitoring, one might, continue to monitor to try to bring in data that is less than, the early segment of the data, or how do you manage that issue?
The protocol and the methodology is designed to isolate those worst case environmental conditions to a reasonable degree. And once you have that condition should be valid whether it happened in the early stages or the end stages of a monitoring campaign. So there is no set maximum that is prescribed. Most of the time, the problem is the minimum, and being able to reasonably say that you've got enough information to make a decision or a conclusion. The other thing you may be able to do if you have more data is to be able to see if within that variation, are there other contaminating factors? So for example, maybe you could, if the number of data points is too high, start narrowing the direction range such that now instead of just looking at everything except upwind, now you can maybe only focus on downwind if you happen to have more data that at your disposal. But I don't think it should be any less valid if all of those conditions are still met.
Okay. And then I also wanted to ask you, someone in the audience, or the participating audience, had mentioned seasonality earlier, and I wanted to see if I could get you to expand on how the protocol you're recommending captures seasonal changes.
Yeah, so that actually is a good question, and this is something that we've started to have more and more experience over the last 5 or so years. The main difference that we see, though, from a seasonality perspective, is that some seasons mask the sound from the turbines more and others mask it less. What we've seen is that the sound from the actual turbines doesn't increase. It pretty well is related to the wind conditions at the hub. What changes, though, is you'll get in the early spring, for example, where there aren't any leaves on most trees, and not all trees, but the ambient is less, so you get less masking noise, and the sound from the turbines will become more audible and more distinct. Whereas if you think about the fall, where there's a lot of foliage on the trees, then the ambient condition masks the sound from the turbines a bit better. So it's not actually the sound from the turbines that change, it's the relative ambient that is the change. So as long as you have a good signal to noise ratio when you do the analysis, let's say you do your measurements, I recommend early spring actually. And if your equipment can take it, the very tail end of winter even, because that's when you've got pretty good wind conditions historically, they're in the shoulder months, and you still don't yet have leaves on your trees. But it's not to say that if you really didn't want to, you couldn't do it in the summertime or the fall. As long as you get that good quality data, the difference between your on and off is big enough so that you can make a good conclusion. That's, to me, more important than whether you also will have to do it in the spring and the fall and the summer and the winter.
Can I maybe just add one thing? When I've wrestled with this a little bit before, with the engineering side, what I think Mr. Ashtiani is saying is that the actual physics of the sound do not change over the seasons. The actual level of the homes doesn't change over the season. What changes is our perception. So we may perceive the turbines to be louder. Usually, typically in my experience, the loudest perception time will be in those dead calm the winter nights where all the crickets are nicely captured under the snow. There's no leaves on the trees. It's a low wind condition at the ground. It's high condition at the hub, and that's when you're going to hear it more. That level that you measure at the home, let's say it's 45 decibels, is the same level you're going to measure at the home in the summer when the trees are leaves and everything else. But we're perceiving it as being, individual perception is that it's not as loud. The actual monitoring, though, to determine compliance of whether it's 45 or not, I think is what Mr. Ashtiani is saying, really doesn't matter from an instrumentation standpoint, except that he needs to be able to sort out that background stuff. So it can be done in any season to figure it out. But our perception is that we should monitor, I often hear, and I was one of those, we got to monitor the worst case hearing conditions, but the physics doesn't actually change. So you can do compliance. For them, it's just trickier to separate the background noise out in those other conditions.
And I take it, Mr. Austin, that you would concur with that answer, that essentially a measured result in July is not likely to be different from November simply because of, okay, that it did.
Yeah, the only caveat to that is if you've got wintertime conditions and icing. That's the only other caveat. But that is not normal operation of the turbines. And even when you look at the, well, I mean, fair, I know what you mean, but when it comes to the actual permitting and the noise level that's been put in there, it's put in not with the turbines operating during an icing condition. Not to say that it's not valid. I mean, if the turbine's making more noise all the time, then it will end up being part of the measurement conditions.
It should be.
Air density? Yeah.
Only if you're measuring it.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
I had one more clarifying question, which was that I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly. Part of the reason you recommended a 1 minute interval and not necessarily a smaller one is that the SCADA meteorological data is typically available at that level. Did I infer that correctly from your?
So the SCADA data is actually typically available in 10-minute intervals. But what we do is we say, I get that it's only 10 minutes, but if it wasn't at the high power for the whole 10 minutes, then I don't know which part of it was high and which part of it wasn't, so we just throw it out. So we only look at times where for the entire 10 minutes, the turbines were operating at whatever the power condition was. So we know that at least for the whole 10 minutes and in each of those individual minutes, if the wind speed was high, then we put it on the high, and if it was low. We could go to 10 seconds, we could go even lower, but it's a practicality perspective. And right now, the amount of granularity we're getting with 1 minute, it seems pretty reasonable. So you just have to know that your interval is sufficient enough that you get a consistent condition during that whole interval. So it's reasonable to assume that for a whole interval, the wind speed, if your average wind speed is 3 meters a second, that you can find times where it's reasonable to assume that for the whole minute it was around 3. But if you get to, let's say, 10 minutes, then I'm less confident that it stayed around 3 and didn't wander off into 7 or 2 or whatever, because I've seen gusty periods where even within a 1 minute you can get a 2, 3, 4 meter a second difference. So the shorter you make that, the more you really parse out the parts that belong in high ambient noise and low ambient noise.
Thank you.
Okay. Following up on the seasonality question, my understanding was that frozen ground may have a different absorption level than summer non-frozen ground, and also that sound wave propagation may be different at different relative humidity levels. I know in the winter my skin gets dry because the atmosphere is dry. I'm wondering whether the sound modeling inputs are able to be toggled to reflect worst case scenarios based on seasonal conditions.
So you're absolutely right, there is a variation, and the reason I didn't go into it is because the variation compared to the overall limit is actually, it's not a huge variation. We're talking about 2 decibels, 3 decibels at the most, that you would get from just changes in temperature and humidity. When the noise modeling is done at the prescribed conditions, it's actually done at 10 degrees C and 7% relative humidity, because that happens to be the combination that gives the least amount of sound absorption as the sound travels for the temperature and relative humidity. So in pretty well all the jurisdictions, the modeling is done under that kind of worst case condition, so anything else would be hopefully lower than that. The ground condition though of 0.5, yeah, that could make a difference of, I don't know, 0.5, 0.6 decibels if you go from a semi-porous to a 100% reflective kind of scenario. 100% reflective is more like over water, and so a snow-ice mix would be probably closer to maybe 0.3, maybe 0.5, but now we're talking about such slight differences that I don't think it warrants doing separate post-construction measurements in the wintertime than the summertime. So the long and short of it is, yes, there's some like slight nuances, but nothing that would be very visible in data analysis, because it's much less than your instrumentation variation.
Can I jump in? You've confused in my my mind your answer to my question earlier now. So if I hear you saying that there's a potential variation of, you said 2 to 3 decibels depending on temperature and humidity conditions?
And ground conditions.
And ground
So if
conditions.
you
The
block
the full package.
Yeah, you put the whole thing together, and you could get from the situation where the sound gets propagated the most efficiently to the situation that the sound gets propagated the least efficiently. You're talking about a 2 to 3 decibel change.
And so what I'm struggling with then, though, is in the scenario where there is a project that is narrowly in compliance with a 45 dBA limit, you know, say the result of your analysis comes in, it's at 44 dBA, is it necessary to then consider those factors in determining compliance?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So if your limit is 45, and actually forget about that, if you actually measure 45.3, is that non-compliant? I would think that all of that has to be taken into account with consideration of the certainty of that measurement. So for example, if you've measured it at 44 plus or minus 1, that means that you're somewhere between 43 and 45. If you measure it at 45.3 or 45 plus or minus 2, that means you're somewhere between 43 and 47. And I would say that any assessment of compliance or non-compliance should be made on a conclusive basis. So if you've got a measurement that is within that uncertainty range, that's just because we're uncertain. And if you want to demonstrate non-compliance, or if you want to make consequences of compliance or non-compliance, my recommendation is to do it in a position where you're sure, not a position where you're within the measurement uncertainty range.
So what you're suggesting is you would only make a conclusion of non-compliance if the measurement uncertainty range is
outside of the
threshold. Okay.
I mean, or you could make it so that your sound level limit is 45 decibels plus or minus a preset value. So, or you could say it's 45 decibels or 46 or something, including any uncertainty in your measurement, so that then that is already taken into account. So now you could actually look at the final exact number. The point though is that the line is not a very thin line. It's got some thickness to it. So if that's the line and you come in somewhere there, you have to know how to deal with times where it's very close to that number.
And in your experience, is there a sort of typical, or is it highly variable based on the specific analysis of the project, what that uncertainty interval would be? If you just suggested setting a standard that sort of builds that in,
Yeah.
I guess what I'm asking you is what number might that be if, you know?
I think 2 decibels is reasonable. So if you've got, let's say, a sound level limit of 40 or 45, and the measurements come in at 41 or 46, or at 39 or 44, I think that's pretty close to being all right. When it gets to more than 2 decibels, then that's something you may want to look at the actual variation. So for example, if your signal to noise was terrible because you happen to be at a site that is close to other sources of noise, so if it happens to be close to a roadway or happens to something that contaminates it a lot, and your uncertainty starts ballooning up, then you may look at those ones a little bit differently in that assessment. But there isn't one clear answer, and a lot of jurisdictions wrestle with this, but it's just something that there should be some common sense when looking at that data.
Thanks.
So you indicated, you showed us a chart earlier with the minute intervals, and it was clear to see that there was an outlier there. Is there a lot of time or judgment into when a sample has been contaminated? Or is it clear when you're looking at the whole data, you have these reams of data, is it hard to pick out the contaminated when it's not like a dog?
In our filtering to say, okay, if the dBA equivalent level is different than the 90th percentile by more than 6 decibels or 10 decibels or something, remove that. And then we play with the actual trend to see, okay, if we have that threshold at 10, let's run it, and you see a whole bunch of outliers go away right away. So it's not something that we have to sit down and listen to individually.
we already know that the level's varying too much because of one big transient event. And so that kind of gets the data quality up a little bit. But there are times where it's actually quite difficult when you're close to something that is constantly contaminating the data. That happens with roadways, sometimes it happens with train lines, it can happen with flight paths. Those are, something that we have to grapple with all the time. But yeah, most of the time though, it's clear when the data quality gets better.
Could I just express a concern based on time? This is Sally Colopy again from Fairfield. Mr. Olson and Mr. Ascianti have had 3 hours. We only have 2 hours left. And we have several presenters left who really deserve equal amount of time.
We're just about to stop.
Okay.
I'm now going to the, we're all done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep, okay, thank you very much. If there's time after we hear from others, we'll come back to you. Based on all the questioning we were getting from the audience for these people, that we thought we would, that people wanted to hear from them, so that's why we were letting it go. But in fact, they've only used up all their time, right? We're a little bit over the time that they were on. Not a lot. Not a lot over what they, because other people ceded time to them, so we took that into account.